seated, please. This Honourable House now resume its sitting. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clark, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Vaz, Mr. Daryl Vaz, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Witter, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mr. Montague, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nito, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright?
Members, before we get into the business of the House today, I wish to recognize among us a number of visitors, young professionals, or those on their way becoming professionals. We have from the University of the West Indies School of Nursing graduate students and their instructors or teachers. Will you welcome them, please? From UTech, School of Business Admin, a number of students and their professors, teachers, or instructors. Will you welcome them, please? Statements by ministers.
Speaker, we have a statement by the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Chuck.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Copies have been made available. I was hoping copies would have been available for everyone, but my office is bringing the rest. But I think I have circulated a few copies to various persons. I know Miss Reverend, the member from Central Kingston, will be interested in this. So could you pass this on to the member from Central Kingston for me, please? Mr. Speaker, the Honourable House is asked to note that Cabinet has approved the tabling of the Chief Justice's statistics report for the parish courts of Jamaica for the period January to June 2018. Members will note that for the first time last year, annual reports were prepared for the Supreme Court and parish courts. These reports were posted on the website of the Supreme Court and tabled in this Honourable House in order to increase transparency in the operations, accountability, and performance of the courts. Mr. Speaker, there has been notable improvements in the administration of cases in the courts. At the parish court level, the Case Information Statistical System, known as CISS in the courts, has been extended to the Civil and Family Divisions, as well as the Coroner's Court and the Special Coroner's Court. Work has commenced to collect similar data for tax and traffic court matters, and reports are now being prepared to include these additional business lines. Quarterly reports are now routinely prepared and are also posted to the Supreme Court website. Mr. Speaker, the statistical system is now being utilized by the courts to effectively manage the cases before them, automate the court processes, commence electronic scheduling, and to track and reduce the backlog in the courts. Case progression officers assigned throughout the parish courts also utilize the electronic data to promote the readiness of criminal cases for court, thus contributing to an improvement in trial readiness and trial date certainty, and improving the case clearance and case disposal rates. Still, Mr. Speaker, the backlog in the court continues to be a major concern. However, Mr. Speaker, it is important to show that progress has been made and is being made in the parish courts. The reports, Mr. Speaker, which is tabled in the House today, will show that there has been significant improvement in the case disposal rates of the courts. The disposal rate, Mr. Speaker, is the proportion of new cases filed within a particular period which have been disposed of within that same period. Now, this is an important point, Mr. Speaker. In other words, in this quarter, we're looking at case disposal rates. So if 100 cases have been filed in a quarter, the case disposal is how many of those same cases that have been disposed of. So that the improvements in the case disposal rates have been used as a catalyst for improving the case clearance rates across the courts. So when we look at the case disposal rates in the corporate area and in the Westmoreland Parish Court, they have the highest disposal rates of 62 to 63%. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is that for every 100 cases that came in that quarter, 62 were disposed of those same cases. So that's the case disposal, because the people would come, probably plead guilty, or settle a matter as the case may be. Now, Mr. Speaker, an average of 2,451 new criminal cases are filed across all parishes on a monthly basis, with a total of 14,824 new criminal cases entering the parish courts for the first 6 months of 2018. 11 courts, Mr. Speaker, have achieved case clearance rates of over 90% and have therefore attained international standards in this respect in the second quarter. Now, the case clearance rate is a ratio of new cases filed to cases completed, regardless of when those cases commenced. So we must distinguish, members, between case disposal rates, which are the new cases which are disposed of within that particular period, as against case clearance rates, which are the number of cases that have been disposed of regardless of when they started. So that what we are saying for the case clearance, we are seeing significant improvements in that for every 100 cases put in that quarter, about 90 cases are being disposed of, and those 90 cases are not necessarily cases that started in that quarter. So, Mr. Speaker, a persistent case clearance rate of less than 100% will result in a backlog. In other words, if you have only 50%, for every 100 cases that comes in and only 50 is cleared, it means 50 goes into backlog. The courts therefore have to target 90 to 100% clearance rate in order to prevent the backlog from persisting in the courts. What I'm happy to report is that we are about close to 90%, which means we are at international standards, but because of the huge backlog, we are not digging into the backlog of cases that now exists. The overall clearance rate for the second quarter of 2018, this is the last quarter, was 98%, an improvement of 9 percentage points over the first quarter. Although these results indicate that there are still more new cases filed than cases disposed of across the parish courts, the overall direction is quite positive for the reduction of the criminal case backlog. In the parish courts of Westmoreland, St. Catherine, and St. Thomas, they have the best cumulative clearance rate so far in 2018, while the parish courts of Clarendon and Hanover were the most improved courts on this measure in the second quarter, with increases of 54.39 and 26.78 percentage points respectively. Mr. Speaker, the international benchmark for case clearance rate is an average of 90 to 110%. The Honourable Chief Justice has set a target of 130 to 140% for case clearance rates in order to clear and prevent a continued backlog. So what this means, Mr. Speaker, if we can get a clearance rate above 100%, we're actually digging into the backlog, and that is why the Chief Justice has said 130 to 140%, which means, Mr. Speaker, for every 100 cases that start, if in that period we can clear up 130 or 140, the backlog will be dramatically reduced over a period of time. The noteworthy improvements in the case clearance and case disposal rates across all parishes have resulted in a case congestion rate falling from 3/10% in the first quarter of 2018 to 223.3% in the second quarter, an improvement of 86.9 percentage points. So what is the congestion? Case congestion rate means the ratio of pending cases disposed in a given period. It is an indication of how fatigued the courts are given the existing state of resources and degree of efficiency. A case congestion rate, Mr. Speaker, of 150%, for example, is an indication that given the resources currently at a court's disposal and its degree of efficiency, it is carrying 1.5 times its capacity. So, Mr. Speaker, when you have a case congestion rate of 223%, the courts is carrying twice the number of cases that it can actually dispose of. So it is overburdened or it is not efficient enough. The ideal case congestion rate should be around 100%, which would indicate that the court's existing resources are efficiently aligned and optimally utilized. If the current trend continues for the next 2 years, the criminal case backlog across the parish courts will be reduced by at least 72%, which would be very significant. This means, Mr. Speaker, that if we manage to sustain the current disposal rate and clearance rate, we will not only clear the backlog, but we will also prevent the creation of new backlog. So, Mr. Speaker, the courts need to dispose of cases at a rate that is faster than the rate of filing in order to clear the backlog and prevent new cases from going into backlog. Mr. Speaker, the courts with the largest number of new cases were the corporate area, St. James and St. Catherine Parish Courts, while Hanover, St. Mary and St. Thomas Parish Courts reported the smallest number of new matters. Mr. Speaker, as a nation, we have a propensity to resolve disputes with violence. This is adding to the burden on the courts. So, Mr. Speaker, the three most frequent criminal charges filed in the parish courts over the period on the report were assault occasioning actual bodily harm, unlawful wounding, and threats. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, our males within a certain age group are the main offenders. 82% of the matters in the courts were committed by males, with the dominant age group of offenders being young men between 20 and 26, and also in the 27 to 36 age group. Mr. Speaker, we have been getting more guilty pleas, and this frees up the court's resources. The statistics have shown that the largest proportion of matters completed in the first 6 months was by way of guilty pleas. This is encouraging, Mr. Speaker. 62.2% of matters being completed were by way of guilty pleas. Mr. Speaker, in the traffic court, there's great concern because since the introduction of data collection, we have been able to capture data which shows the amount of new matters listed in the traffic courts for the first 6 months of this calendar year. 65,195 new matters were listed for the period January to June. 88% of them resulted in warrants, which means, Mr. Speaker, only 12% of these traffic violators are actually turning up in the traffic courts. The sad thing about it, Mr. Speaker, is that many of these warrants have not been issued, largely because of the vast amount of time consumed in preparing these warrants. But more significantly, Mr. Speaker, there has been historically been a gap in the information systems between the tax office and the courts. The court is unable to confirm whether the traffic courts were paid at the the traffic tickets were paid at the tax office, and so there tends to be a reluctance to proceed with the warrants. This gap, Mr. Speaker, enables persons to accumulate a large number of traffic tickets without sanctions being imposed. The four entities, Mr. Speaker, involved, the courts, the tax office, the Jamaica Constabulary Force, and the Island Traffic Authority, fall under four different ministries. And so greater collaboration is necessary to bridge this gap and streamline the process. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, at various levels at which I sit, we see this problem. And that is why you have far too many traffic violators with hundreds of tickets, because the warrants have not been prepared and executed. And this is a matter, Mr. Speaker, that has to be addressed if we are going to curb the indiscipline on the roads. Because far too many traffic violators get a traffic ticket and throw it away because they know that at the moment warrants are not being issued. But I would like to send a signal to them that this is being cleared up. They will soon have their warrants executed, which means that not only will they be charged and arrested, but if necessary, brought back to court to respond to the charge. Mr. Speaker, the courts are moving in the right direction. The steady progress exhibited by the parish courts in the case disposal and case clearance rate is an indication of the potential of the courts to make meaningful inroads in reducing the existing backlog of cases. and that matters are completed within 2 years, and in so doing, preventing new matters from falling into backlog. This, Mr. Speaker, is another step in achieving a justice system of which the people of Jamaica can be proud, one that is characterized by fairness, timeliness, and efficiency. A world-class justice system, Mr. Speaker, is the goal of the Chief Justice Brian Sykes, a goal that is fully supported by this government, and I know in this Parliament we endorse that goal.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a good thing to see that the consistent effort that has been put into the improvements and reforms of the justice system continue to bear fruit. And the particular fruit that we have before us today is the compilation of data and statistics derived from data. It should not be underestimated how much work has gone in to enabling this to happen. It was part of the work program under the JUST program to develop a statistical capacity within the courts, case flow management, and case management. And the capacity has been growing, and we're now seeing more regular reports giving us information which can be used for decision making, for planning, and for policy development. This is very important because what isn't measured doesn't get done, and often decisions are taken, if they are taken in the absence of data and accurate information, you really don't know whether you're making the right decision or whether the decision ought to be adjusted in some other way. So this is progress, and I certainly am pleased to see the progress that is continuing. A great deal of effort has been put into a range of measures that result in the cases being disposed of at a more rapid rate. Here we have the measurement of the rate at which they're being disposed of or not, as the case may be. But the reasons for why they're able to be disposed of are a whole host of things which have been done in the past and are continuing to be done to make that an ever-improving process. And of course, we support all efforts to improve the justice system, to make it more efficient and for it to deliver both access to justice for our people, but a more meaningful and responsive process for those who engage with the justice sector. A couple of areas of concern continue to be the issue to do with traffic tickets and the fact that the data around the issuing of tickets and the entry of those cases in the court system is not being comprehensively recovered and mined and used as a tool for addressing the issue of aberrant drivers on the road. This is an issue that we grappled with in the Public Order Committee of Subcommittee of Cabinet when we were in office, and as you've identified, it crosses several ministries, and a lot of it is to do with the absence of a system, an IT system, which all of those entities can use, whether it be to track what's happening at the tax office, what's happening at the court offices, what's happening at the various record points across the system. So it's concerning to me to see that this is still a problem. I know it's a difficult and challenging problem. I'm not in any way saying that it's an easy fix, because I know it isn't. But it's something which I think will yield rich dividends if we're able to solve it, for the very reasons that you've identified, which is that with the lack of a consistent and cohesive system for dealing with these issues, there is impunity, or a sense of impunity, among some drivers who feel that they can game the system, so to speak. And we know that we hear these reports of accidents being caused by drivers who have multiple outstanding tickets and so on. Hopefully the Road Traffic Act should go some way towards addressing some of those issues, but that won't fix this problem of information being in the system and retrievable on a timely basis. So that is an area where more work needs to be done. I know, Minister, that in the civil courts, in the parish jurisdiction, there has been concern about the length at which those cases take to be disposed of. We increased the jurisdiction of the civil courts a few years back to $1 million from, I think it was 200,000 before. And that obviously involved greater flow of cases into the parish courts, which would otherwise have flowed into the Supreme Court. And partly as a result of that, I think the dates that you get for trials being set and so on in civil matters are often further out into the future than they once were. But I'm hoping that as we get to grips with the criminal jurisdiction, which I think we're increasingly getting to grips with in terms of different strategies for reducing backlog and reducing the time, the case disposal time and so on, more attention will start to be shown to the civil side of things, because ultimately that affects our competitiveness as an economy and our ease of doing business rankings, our competitive rankings internationally, where these things are measured and flow into the overall ranking of the country. So that's an area which I think I hope to see some more progress being made in that area in the future. The last point I wish to make in this brief response is to note that the most up-to-date estimated backlog of criminal cases in the parish courts is 29,724 cases. The media has consistently inaccurately reported the level of backlog in the courts. We hear numbers of over 400,000 cases, and this is going back for years. They've been saying this over and over again, despite repeatedly reports coming to Parliament showing that that is not the case. 90% of criminal cases go into the parish courts. So if the backlog in the parish courts is 29,742 cases, the backlog in the Supreme Court level, whether it be the gun court or the circuit courts, is going to be significantly less than that. So it is time for the newspapers and others that show an interest in the justice sector to update their the number that they use when they talk about backlog, because it isn't helpful for a totally wrong and exaggerated number to be constantly repeated. So, Minister, as I say, a lot of the work that you have done over the last couple of years has been a welcome continuation of work that preceded you. We now have restorative justice on the law books. We want to see it roll out and made real across the island. You're building your justice centres parish by parish, and I assume more restorative justice centres will, each of those parish centres will have a restorative justice capability within them. And child diversion has now become law. We want to see more of the cases involving children who come into conflict with the law shifted out of the court system into a more holistic response, which the child diversion system is supposed to deliver. We have the Joint Select Committee reviewing sexual offences, and we know that a very high percentage of the sexual offences in the Supreme Court are really teenage promiscuity cases involving youngsters who are engaging in promiscuous activity, but not in any way predatory conduct or any act of violence or duress. That is a social problem rather than a criminal problem, and I'm confident that we will find a solution in the Joint Select Committee that will address that issue as well, and reduce the number of cases coming into the Supreme Court of teenagers who have found themselves in a very serious legal situation with the potential for being in the sex offenders registry for decades to come and so on as a result of promiscuous activity. So, Mr. Minister, this is good to see these reports coming. We look forward to similar reports coming for the circuit and gun courts, so we can see what's happening there. I know the gun courts have been a real challenge at the Supreme Court level in terms of the backlog and case disposal rates, and indeed conviction rates, which are surprisingly low, or in my time they were surprisingly low relative to circuit, where the conviction rate in the gun court was around 30% whereas in the circuits it tended to be 50 to 60% at that time. I'm not sure what it is now. And that's counterintuitive because the gun court is designed to be a quicker court. You don't have committal proceedings or what used to be preliminary inquiries. You don't have jury impaneling and so on. So it's a trial by a judge alone, and that was designed to be a quicker way of addressing gun cases. So it ought not to have the inefficiencies that became a feature of it. And hopefully the reforms that are being driven through now, including the reforms to make guilty pleas a more viable option, and we're seeing that working, and that, as you've said in your report, is increasingly the main way of disposing of cases, which is a good thing from where I sit, though I know some people have their doubts about it. But overall, Minister, it is good to see that the work continues and is bearing fruit. And as usual, you know, I will always be willing to cooperate in any way I can to assist that process. Thank you very much.
Mr. Treat.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister indicate what other reasons beyond the increase of guilty pleas that would warrant and of course the welcome increase in the cases disposed of in the report he has given? Further, would the Minister indicate how long this 130% will take in order to be achieved? You've told us that if it is achieved, then in 2 years the backlog will be dealt with. How long will it take to get to that 130? What 30%? What is the projection so that we can track it? Further, Mr. Speaker, in respect of the traffic offences, the Minister might want to tell us what are the measures for the consolidation of the 4 different agencies that seem to be tripping over each other. What is the consolidation that we can look forward to? Mr. Speaker, could the Minister indicate, following the remarks of the member from South St. Andrew, the plans regarding the delays in the civil court? Mr. Speaker, I had a case set down for assessment of damages a month ago, and the date given was July 2019. That's for an assessment of damages which will take less than 2 or 3 hours. Now that we are coming to grips with the criminal backlog, we need really to understand the impact on productivity, the grave personal suffering that takes place in tortious matters when that level of delay has become normative. Are we planning to increase the complement of judges and courtrooms to deal with this? Is that on the target? And lastly, Mr. Speaker, has the Minister inquired of himself and of his officials what accounts for the preponderance of young males being the major element of those who are accused of criminal offences? I think if we just deal with the incidents rather than with the causation, we will be selling ourselves short.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Trump.
let me thank the members from Central Kingston and South St. Andrew, and also to indicate that the member from South St. Andrew, that a lot of the improvements, yes, started with your Under the Just program, and as we know, justice has no political color. So that, as far as I'm concerned, we work together to make sure that the justice system can improve. In relation to the backlog, though, member, my understanding is that it has moved from 29, nearly 30,000, to closer to 20,000 over the past year. That it is now at 29? I thought it had been reduced, but I'll check on that. Yes, I'll check on that. The issue, Mr. Speaker, in relation to the member from Central Kingston, the reasons for other reasons for the improvement, I think that the Chief Justice has sent the message to the judges that to reduce the number of mention and trial dates. If a case is ready, send it to trial. So a lot of more cases, in my understanding, are being tried now because we are looking at certainty of a case being tried once a trial date is set. So the statistician is looking now at certainty of a trial taking place, so that they're looking at how many trial dates a case actually take before it is tried, and how many mention dates, and also the reasons for putting off cases month after month, month after month. And we have met with the police at the National Council on Justice and say that within 4 to 6 months, if you charge a man, your case, the file should be ready. That is what caused so many mention dates, because the files are not ready. So we are asking the police force, once you charge a man, within 4 to 6 months, the file should be ready. That is happening, so that may have contributed towards the disposal. Now, obviously, member from Central Kingston, to get to 130, 140% can be dealt with in two ways. It means if you can settle more matters, restorative justice, child diversion, mediation, from actually coming to the court, then it means less cases come to the court and less backlog or less cases being tried. So the 130 to 140% can be arrived at faster than if the same number of cases are coming and the same number of cases are being tried. So if the same number of cases are being tried and less cases are coming, it's easier to get to the 130, 140%. But at the same time, I know in several seminars, the Chief Justice has emphasized the need for cases, once they're set, for them to be tried, and for not more than 2 cases to be set for trial on any day, because when you set 5 cases or more cases on a date, you're wasting the time of dozens of persons who have to come to court for those cases to be tried. So what I've heard him indicating to the judges and to the prosecutors and to the lawyers, not more than 2 cases, and make sure that they're tried during the period that they have been set for. The matter of traffic tickets and traffic matters is something both members and members in the House is of great concern. And I know the Prime Minister at Road Safety Council that it is a matter where the Road Traffic Act comes up for assessment regularly. Because the truth of the matter is we need to look at how we actually charge traffic violators. At the moment, you have to catch them, serve them with a ticket. In many countries, including America, you can actually charge a traffic violator by the camera pinpointing the vehicle that is being driven, that has violated traffic, and you immediately send the charge to that vehicle. But traffic violators now are charged and not the vehicle. So if the vehicle was charged, then when they come to be renewed, then it can't be renewed unless the fines are paid. And that is something that is being looked at in terms of the new Road Traffic Act before it is passed. I mean, the owner, sorry. I mean, well, it's the vehicle. Slap it. So either the driver, the owner, or whoever is operating the vehicle will have to pay the fine. Well, if they don't pay before they come in, and you may well make it a penalty. If they don't pay, and they pay at the time they're relicensing, then you charge them a penalty. Exactly. So the position, Mr. Speaker, is that being examined carefully to see if that can be done in addition to when a person has violated, you stop the vehicle and you charge the driver. It seems to me more appropriate that you pinpoint not only the driver but the vehicle, because you know the vehicle has to be relicensed and therefore the traffic ticket has to be paid. So, Mr. Speaker, these are matters that need to be cleared up because the indiscipline on the road and the poor police officers are issuing thousands of tickets, but traffic violators are ignoring them, and it needs to be addressed rather than, and you can see, I know the frustration you had because we're having the same frustration between ministries talking to one another and making sure that, you know, the thing is dealt with properly. In relation to the civil cases, there's no doubt that we need more judges to try the cases. In truth, I'm looking at the constitutional motion to increase the age limit, but we also would like to look at practitioners. Sitting, we have them in England, recorders. So to the extent that we can use practitioners to deal with some of these cases is something that I would like to discuss further with the judiciary, how that could operate. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that we are definitely assiduously looking at how we can get cases being tried within a timely manner. And what you're saying, there's no reason why a simple assessment of damages should take 6 months. It should take 6 days rather than 6 months. So these are matters, member, that we are working closely to make sure we can improve. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Shimura.
Amendments to the anti-guns.
Mr. Speaker, I said you haven't reached me yet.
No.
Announcements.
That's all the statement, please. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Minister Paper number 93, Parish Courts of Jamaica. Chief Justice's first and second quarterly statistical report for January to June 2018. Minister Paper number 94, entitled Cabinet Agenda Issues, dated August 7, 2018. Minister Paper number 95, an annual report of the Office of Utilities Regulation for the year 2017-2018. The Auditor General's review of the fiscal policy paper for the year 2018-2019 interim report. Auditor General's Department certified appropriation account, head 2823, Court of Appeal 2012 to 2013. Head 2826, Family Court for the years 2012-13, 2013-14, and 2014-15.
Bills brought from the Senate.
The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honourable House of Representatives. I have the honour to advise the Honourable House of Representatives that on the 5th day of October 2018, a bill entitled An Act to Give Effect to the Provisions of the International Convention for the Control and Management of Ships' Ballast Water and Sediments 2004 was passed in the Senate with 14 amendments for which the Honourable Senate desires the concurrence of this Honourable House. Signed, Thomas Tavares Finson, QC, CD, JP, President of the Senate.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Minister.
I now ask that the Senate amendments to the bill shortly entitled the Ballast Water Management Act be considered and approved at a later date.
Those in favour? Aye. Those against? As have it. Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Warmington.
I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move the following motion. Be it resolved that notwithstanding the motion approved by this Honourable House on the 13th day of March 2018, outlining the composition of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee of this House, that the name Rudyard Spencer be removed and the name Dave Humes Brown be substituted therefore, and the name Eroy Clark be substituted substituted for James Robertson as at October 2nd, 2018. Be it resolved with reference to the resolution passed by this Honourable House on the 13th day of February 2018, agreeing that the composition of all committees of the House remain unchanged in this session of Parliament, except by approved resolution of this House, that the following be approved, notwithstanding Standing Order 68, subsection 3, the names Rudyard Spencer and James Robertson be removed from the Economic and Production Committee, and the names Clifford E. Warmington and Dave U. Browns be substituted therefore. The name D, that the name Rudyard Spencer be removed from the Privilege Committee, and the name Xavier Main be substituted therefore. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take these motions.
Minister Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I'll move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Food Storage and Prevention of Infestation Amendment Act 2018.
Questions and answers to questions.
Mr. Speaker, the House will recall that earlier this year I indicated that our intention was to answer the questions as they became due. The Prime Minister will be answering questions today. He will deal with that. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes when these questions are asked and they are due, and I advise prior to the sittings that it is our intention to answer these questions, the members are not here to ask that they be responded to. So the Prime Minister will explain the situation in respect of the ones that he has to answer for the member from East Kingston and Port Royal. Prime Minister.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 3 questions standing in the name of the member from East Kingston and Port Royal that were asked of me. I have the answers ready. I will table the answers, and I'm available, Mr. Speaker, for follow-up questions if the member chooses to ask follow-up questions next week. Mr. Speaker, question number 20, standing in the name of the member from Central Manchester, is due today. I've had discussion with the member. There are some technical issues with the question that would need the presence of a representative from the Port Authority who is not here today. And so we have agreed that I'll table the questions, and then at an appropriate time next week or so, I'll table the answers. I keep saying I'll table the answers. And then at an appropriate time, maybe at the next sitting, we will take the full deliberation in the House. So I'm, at this time, Mr. Speaker, tabling 4 questions. And I'm...
Answers. 4 answers. Answers to 4 questions.
I'm tabling questions. Answers to 4 questions.
That sounds right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
PM,
Is it second time?
I keep making that...
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Tweed.
Mr. Speaker, at the expiry of 21 days, I'd like the answers to the following questions from which I'm posing to the Minister of Education through the House Leader.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Martin. Get your mic together for me, please.
Mr. Speaker, I also had a question in my name for the Minister of Finance and the Public Service. I was wondering if the House Leader could give an indication as to when we could get an answer on that.
Mr. Simuda, can you...
No, as in previous undertakings, I will ensure that the answers to those questions asked of the Minister of Finance are taken either next week. I'm sure he's ready to answer, either next week or the week after. That is off the island now attending an IMF World Bank meeting, so he's unable to be here to answer them. But I'm sure as soon as he gets back, he will be prepared to answer them. He's usually very proactive.
Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without the leave of the House first obtained. Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motions, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favour? Those against? As have it.
Mr. Speaker, the motion, speak to the motion, explain why the persons. We replace these members because they do not have enough time to devote to the committees. Therefore, we replace them with persons who will have members who will have adequate time to deal with the business of these committees. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the motion be approved.
Those in favour? Those against? As have it.
Mr. Speaker, we have an interesting day ahead of us. However, the member from Central Kingston has an item on the order paper, continuation of the motion that was started and will be completed today. The Minister of Agriculture, Industry, Agriculture and Fisheries will make a contribution. So too will the Minister of Health. But Mr. Speaker, I must bring to your attention the fact that we are working assiduously to reduce the size of this order of business paper. And so today we will be having 4 responses to 4 reports from the Appropriations Committee. In addition, we will also be dealing with the resolution standing in the name of the member from West Rural St. Andrew, and the resolution standing in the name of the member from Central St. James. So, Mr. Speaker, in respect of the resolution from Central St. James, the member and Minister of Labour and Social Security will be making a contribution to that resolution. The opposition, I expect, will want to contribute as well, but we want to close those today. But, Mr. Speaker, what the member from Central Kingston loses on the turn, he picks up on the roundabout. Because standing in his name are some 20 resolutions, and he keeps coming with more every day. But that's excellent, and I thank you for it. I thank you for it, because I will be calling on you to carry 2 and 3 every session until we get to the point where we are current. If you understand what I'm saying, member, we want to be current with our debating. We can't be debating something that was moved in 2016. It has lost its impact and its relevance. So I thank you for it. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you now call on the minister, the former Minister of Education, member from Central Kingston, to contribute at the end of the presentations by the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Health. Minister of Agriculture. You did, I said, after you speak.
Did you see Mr. Tweed will move first?
In case you might have been misled, this will be about the third major presentation in the debates this year. So make your contribution.
Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. I rise to contribute to the debate which on the motion number 3 regarding from the member from Central Kingston regarding the increased use of nutritious local produce under the school feeding program. As Minister with portfolio responsibility for agriculture and manufacturing,
can we have some order, please?
I want to indicate...
Can we have some order so that the member can get to make his presentation?
I want to indicate, Mr. Speaker, that we on this side, we support all efforts to buy Jamaican and to eat Jamaican. And the motion before us, in fact, is not novel. On a historical note, this matter took center stage when the member from West Central St. Catherine, now Minister of Health, in his capacity as then Minister of Agriculture, championed a memorandum of understanding on this matter in conjunction with the then Minister of Education, now our most honorable Prime Minister. A draft memorandum of understanding was prepared involving the Ministries of Agriculture, Education, and Industry and Commerce to increase the use of local foods in the school feeding program. Enormous effort was made by the Agriculture Ministry to have the MOU signed without success due to resistance in certain quarters. Mr. Speaker, as a further indication that this administration is convinced of the wisdom of such a policy, during our last tenure in government, we initiated and did substantial work on the food and nutrition security policy, which was subsequently finalized and approved by Cabinet and later tabled in both Houses of Parliament in March of 2013. So, Mr. Speaker, I have a copy of this document, which of course reflects the joint efforts of both governments, and it was the previous government that tabled the final document entitled Food and Nutrition Security Policy, Government of Jamaica, Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries and Ministry of Health, dated March 2013. This was actually tabled in the House on that occasion. So, Mr. Speaker, while I will not comment on the member's figure of 80% of school feeding program constituting imported ingredients, he did not cite the statistical source, but it does not detract from the need to reduce the level of imports in the school feeding program. That we totally agree on. That is a core issue that both sides of this House support. We are confident that the policy framework exists, therefore, Mr. Speaker, both in the form of a policy and through the Memorandum of Understanding. There is therefore no need for a new policy that already exists. What there is now is the need for implementation and aggressive implementation. From the perspective of production, let me confirm that the agricultural sector can produce and make more local foods available to support students through the school feeding program. There are several agricultural products in which we already have achieved 100% market share that can be used in the school feeding program, such as carrots, callaloo, cabbage, pumpkin, sweet potato, breadfruit, cassava, yam, and green banana, just to name a few. In fact, I brought samples, Mr. Speaker, to show you today of the flour derived from breadfruit and cassava and a tasty granola mix made from sweet potatoes. Yes, agriculture man with his bag. This is breadfruit flour, Mr. Speaker. This is breadfruit flour. Made in Jamaica. Cassava flour. Made in Jamaica. And by the way, these locally produced flour from locally produced agricultural products, these, unlike regular imported flour, these are gluten-free. Gluten-free, so they are healthier for us. And we have sweet potato with granola, cereal, and snack mix combined with Jamaican sweet potato. These are some examples. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if the school feeding program were to enter into contracts with specific farmers, these farmers would welcome this and we would increase agricultural production, employment, and farm income in rural areas. But it cannot be left as a voluntary exercise. This is something that obviously will have to be driven by the government. And we want to give this Honourable House the assurance that we have every intention to do so. Mr. Speaker, a very important food that we must incorporate into the school feeding program is sweet potatoes, for example. It's a very healthy food for us to feed to our children while they are in school. Information passed to me indicates that sweet potato contains over 15 health benefits. 15 health benefits, including prevention of vitamin A deficiency, improvement in vision, management of weight, and management of diabetes. Sweet potatoes can also help in the fight against certain cancers, help in the regulation of blood pressure, prevent ulcers, and are also memory enhancing. Memory enhancing. I look at another one, Mr. Speaker. Pumpkin. Pumpkin puree is another important food that we must look to incorporate into the school feeding program. And in fact, I'm going to ask the orderly, please, at the permission of the Speaker, I have some samples of sweet potato and pumpkin in cooked form, and in the case of the sweet potato, it's cooked and canned, and then you have mashed potato, you have the pumpkin puree that is canned and has a 2-year life in the can. 2 years life in the can. So it can be exported, it can be sold to the hotels, it can be used in our school feeding program, it can be used as soup. You put chicken, locally produced chicken, in the locally produced pumpkin and have a lovely, healthy chicken pumpkin soup. You have pumpkin pie. We even have Scotch bonnet peppers that will be in that little package that you are going to get. You're not allowed to eat any now, but you are allowed to look at the samples. Mr. Speaker, pumpkin puree contains 10% of our daily requirement for potassium. 10%, which is needed to support a healthy digestive system. A cup of pumpkin puree also supplies, and by the way, the one you have there, no sugar is added to it. When you taste it later on, it has a sweet taste to it, natural taste. No sugar added. Right? A cup of pumpkin puree also supplies 3.4 grams of iron a mineral that supports the immune system. Carota oil, the compound that gives pumpkins their bright orange color, are powerful antioxidants that play an important role in disease prevention. These are just two of the crops that are available year-round in Jamaica, easily produced, and will prove cost-effective for us to incorporate into the school feeding program, Mr. Speaker. These crops are also easy to utilize in the meal plans for our children. For example, pumpkin puree can be used in the soups prepared for your children and in muffin mixes. Since many of our crops are seasonal, we need to also explore processing to lengthen shelf life, or if you want me to put on my marketing hat, I can say to facilitate time and place utility. This conversation has already started with Jampro, informing me that they are working with companies that intend to produce local foods for the United Kingdom market. The company has indicated that it is exploring the feasibility of selling canned vegetables into the United Kingdom, our local hotels as well, and for the school feeding program. I have been requested 1,000 acres of land has already been requested of the ministry through the sugar company holdings for the express production of this. And some of these samples you received today are actually samples of those things that will be produced. Mr. Speaker, these products will contain no artificial preservatives and will utilize 100% Jamaican-grown crops. On the matter of fruits, this one has special significance for me, Mr. Speaker. Members will recall that in my sectoral contribution this year, I spoke about the goal of planting millions of fruit trees over the next 5 years. We are laying the groundwork now for a provision to be included in the budget to support a pilot project. We expect to approach multilateral agencies, including the Climate Change Fund, to seek support for a robust fruity food tree program. And I want to take note of the work that a Jamaican-led overseas charitable group is spearheading, the Trees That Feed Foundation. They have already helped to plant over 20,000 breadfruit trees in Jamaica. And we need to plant hundreds of thousands more breadfruit trees. Instead of feeding our little children at school with synthetic flour and rice, feed them with naturally grown gluten-free breadfruit flour and cassava flour, healthier for our children. Mr. Speaker, as it is well known, we are now rationalizing the sugar lands under the sugar company holdings of Jamaica. We'll be encouraging investor farmers to apply for lands to produce those crops for which there is demand. In a meeting earlier with the SCJ, today and last week, we have been advised that there are hundreds of applications received for the leasing of thousands of acres of lands for alternative crops. And I'll shortly be making an announcement on this matter after presentation to our cabinet. But it is nothing short of really encouraging. I want to say to this Honourable House that is really exciting and encouraging the level of interest being shown by people who want land. They want to produce a range of things, from these things that I've mentioned to castor nuts for castor oil, which people are putting, using bogus castor oil abroad and put made in Jamaica on it. Sea Island cotton, you name it, a whole range of things, right? Mango orchards, we need to put in place because we now have an agreement with the United States to use technology of irradiation to allow for the importation into the United States of fresh mangoes into that territory. And of course, What you don't sell fresh? Puree. Can it. Use it as a natural fruit product for our children here in schools as well, instead of giving them bag juice, sugar and water. Fruit juice is better for our children. Naturally grown fruit juice in Jamaica is far better for our children than bag juice. And so there's no shortage of interest in alternative crops for production on these lands. There's interest in onions, sweet corn, sweet pepper, Scotch bonnet peppers. I walk with the Scotch bonnet pepper today, so see there? These are beautiful Scotch bonnet peppers produced at Ebony Park, right? Produced at, look at the high quality. Look at this, right? And what we're doing, what they have done is to crush the Scotch bonnet peppers. See it here? This is crushed Scotch bonnet peppers, ready for the market, local and export market. Absolute Scotch bonnet pepper mash. So we have Scotch bonnet pepper mash, diced sweet potatoes, 2 years life in this can. 2 years? Yes, pumpkin puree. The life of this in this can, 2 years. And you make, for schools, we make it in larger cans. 1 gallon, 5 gallon cans. The hotels on the North Coast, wherever they are, no preservatives. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We are sitting on wealth here that you know, in every adversity is said there is a seed of greater benefit. The adversity and the problems we face with sugar today, we are now forced to rationalize the production of sugar in a more efficient way on smaller acreages and move into other areas of production so we can be self-sufficient in this country and feed our children more healthily in our schools. Very critical. We have papayas, Sea Island cotton, coconut, bamboo, and don't forget cannabis, and solar parks on marginal land. Mr. Speaker, it is well established that Jamaica has the capacity to produce chicken based on demand, and we know chicken is our most economic source of protein. If we take a measured and deliberate approach to building demand through the school feeding program, our farmers will respond and we will build the supply capacity. The real problem is that we have a demand or affordability constraint. Demand is a function of price. This is what is constraining the implementation of the policy in some respects, and we have to deal with that reality. In the case of carbohydrates, the reality is that local carbohydrates are less economical and more demanding to cook than certain imported carbohydrates such as rice and flour. In order to substitute more local carbohydrates, a trade-off is necessary. Using more local foods could result in an increase in the budget of the Education Ministry if we are to feed the same number of children. The Ministry of Agriculture in the past expended enormous effort in trying to get the Ministry of Education to use more local foods. This only was met with marginal success due to cost. We have to make that trade-off now. Mr. Speaker, the way forward will be to target a gradual increase in the local content of the school feeding budget until we find a suitable optimum position. It will be recalled that under the Public Procurement Law of 2015 and regulations now in the process of being promulgated, there is expectation that domestic content will be a consideration in specific government procurement. In light of the policy commitment of both administrations, I'll be going to Cabinet with a submission to increase the domestic content in the school feeding program. As part of the process, I'll initiate consultations with the Minister of Education and the Minister of Health to get a commitment so that this can be considered in the budget for 2019-2020. Following that consultation, we'll go to Cabinet with a submission on the matter. Mr. Speaker, we have to eventually go to legislation if necessary to ensure that we eat what we grow. Eat what we grow, because what we are growing here is far healthier for us than the stuff that we are importing and feeding to our children. So I welcome the motion by the Honourable Member and indicate that working together, let us put our children and our country first. Thank you very much.
I now ask the Minister of Health to make his contribution. Yeah.
Dr. Tufton. Mr. Shaw, could you turn off your mic, please?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues. I rise, Mr. Speaker, to give critical support to the motion that has been moved and commented on by the member from Central Kingston. A couple of issues, Mr. Speaker, in regards to the motion. The first line of the motion recognizes, Mr. Speaker, that some 80% of ingredients of the school feeding program have to be imported, and I seek some clarity if the member is referring to the school feeding program in general, where schools are given actual subsidies to develop a program, or are you referring specifically to that component of the program carried out by Nutrition Products Limited? When you rise to speak, because currently, Mr. Speaker, colleagues, there's a significant and qualitative distinction between the role that Nutrition Products Limited plays. In fact, I am told, having had to dialogue with my colleague ministers in education, one here, one in the upper house, that just below 3% or somewhere about of the overall school feeding program is conducted through Nutrition Products Limited. In other words, Nutrition Products Limited commands a significantly less important role, because the policy of schools have now shifted, or the Education Ministry's policy, towards giving a subsidy to the schools, and the schools in turn would use that subsidy to provide. So, I think it may be important to just create some clarity there. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the issue again contained in the motion around imports. 80% of the ingredients are imported. And again, some perhaps clarity on that, not to question the extent of the imports, but to discuss the practicality of how we can reduce, or whether or not we can eliminate that. I take from my colleague member, meaning eliminate imports in total. I appreciate my colleague Minister of Agriculture, and having been there, particularly appreciate his position as it relates to the steps that are being taken. And I know that steps are being taken as part of the government's efforts. But again, in all practical terms, the question is going to have to come up and be discussed as to whether or not, or as to how far you can create a substitution effect as it relates to the school feeding program. And I'm speaking more generally now about the program, including nutrition products, but also around the subsidies. And I say that in the context of
the importance of that replacement as the focal point of the motion. Because if you look from a health and wellness perspective, which is the underlying theme within your motion, separate and apart from the substitution effect of replacing imports with local produce. Mr. Speaker, I dare say that perhaps more importantly to the substitution effect, as important as that is to ensure that our children achieve a balanced diet that acts in their best health and wellness interests. And as a consequence, I would dare be presumptuous, member, to tweak your motion a bit and include in the overall discussion the need for the health and wellness focus and emphasis as a separate and fundamental part of a discussion around the school feeding program, separate and apart from the need to substitute imports from local. And I raise that, Mr. Speaker, in the context of the evidence that is before us. And certainly the member mentions it when he speaks about excessive consumption of salts and sugars and the need for better dietary habits and so on. And I fully support the member on that. And the evidence supports his position. The reality is that our young people at a stage and age of their development where they are acquiring habits which ultimately becomes cultural and ultimately defines how the quality of their lives later on from a health and wellness perspective based on their likes and their preferences are and have become increasingly vulnerable within that very environment that is supposed to provide them the guidance in a holistic way, not just the academic guidance, but the lifestyle practices guidance as we prepare them for a life of adolescent, adulthood, leadership in our society more generally. There is no doubt, which makes the member's motion very important, that we are at risk. Our children are at risk. The future generation is at risk from a health and wellness perspective. And by extension, therefore, we as leaders, both sides, across the board, have a lot of work to do to cauterize and address that risk and to provide a better opportunity for our young people to grow, to develop, to flourish, and to become the future generations of the future. The data supports the need for radical reforms. And this government is aware of it. Let me state that up front. And I, as well as my colleague, Minister of Education, Minister of Agriculture, with the Honourable Prime Minister's support and the Cabinet, have been championing that cause, and there is more to come. I'm going to point out just quickly the starting point of why I say we are at risk. If you examine, member, colleagues, the critical surveys, the data collection and assessment of our age cohort that qualifies to be a part of the school population, from a health and wellness perspective, it supports the concern that you raise and the concerns that we have, and I have certainly spoken about. For starters, the Global Student-Based Health Survey, if we are to compare the two most recent surveys, the 2017 survey with the 2010 survey, that's where they go in and they assess a representative sample of the school age cohort, and they do all the necessary clinical assessment, qualitative and quantitative, to determine essentially or effectively the health profile of our school population. Tells us that our young people are at greater risk, are at increasing risk of being ill before they reach the age of maturity. Let me give you some of the data. Percentage of students ages 13 to 15 years who are overweight 2010, boys, 18.1%. 2017, 22.8%. This is over a 7-year period, moving from 18 to 23% effectively. Girls, 25% in 2010. In 2017, 28.5%. Again, a trend increasing. Percentage of students aged 13 to 15 years who are obese. 2010 boys, 5.3%. 2017, 10.3%. Mr. Speaker, colleagues, that's a 100% increase over a 7-year period in terms of obesity of our age cohort, 13 to 15 years. And in the case of girls, 6.7% to 9.9%. If you average that, Mr. Speaker, in terms of obesity levels, you're looking at somewhere in the high 60s, close to 70% over a 7-year period of that age cohort that are becoming obese. And in simple language, it means that they are becoming more susceptible to lifestyle diseases, NCDs, non-communicable diseases, which is worrying and has to be worrying for us. Mr. Speaker, if you look at undernutrition, which is also contained in the motion, again from this study, 2010 and 2017, 13 to 15 years. In boys, it's 1.8%. In 2017, it's 5.5%. That's almost a 200% increase. And in girls, 6.7 to 9.9%. Again, fairly significant. So what we have then, Mr. Speaker, in summary, is that between this last 7 years, from 2010 to 2017, we are seeing an age cohort that is becoming more overweight and obese, and we are seeing an increase in the percentage of students who basically are malnourished, where nutrition is concerned. That, to my mind, is enough reason, Mr. Speaker. And incidentally, in the 70s, maybe even in the late 60s, certainly in the 70s, it was undernourishment or malnourishment that was the big issue. Today, the big challenge is about overweight and obesity. So there is a lot of filling that's taking place. The issue is, what is the balance of all the food groups to give you the appropriate nutrition to give you your best potential of them. Now, Mr. Speaker, the issue is not just about food, and again, I think it's important to sort of widen the discussion, if I may, member, because there are other challenges within the school system that is providing an issue for young people. The sedentary lifestyle, the inactivity is a huge problem. So while we are consuming and being filled, but not nutritionally so, we're also engaging in lifestyle activities that reduces significantly our levels of activity and therefore our capacity to burn some of that filling. And at some point, there's going to have to be a debate in this House and a policy that looks, Mr. Speaker, at technology addiction. My terminology. Technology addiction. Technology has been probably the greatest thing to mankind in several ways. It has brought us more benefits than we would have cared to imagine based on the rate of innovation globally and the adoption of that innovation in all forms, whether for travel, for entertainment, for communication, for business, for pleasure, whatever it is. But that very source of increased utility has created another set of challenges, and indeed I would say a crisis that is affecting perhaps more than any other cohort, that younger, more impressionable population within our schools. The use, Mr. Speaker, of cell phones, which frankly speaking is a computer. Once upon a time, you couldn't use a computer unless you could go to where it is. Today, a smartphone allows you to take your computer wherever you want to go. You can do everything on it. And while it comes with significant benefits, speak to the educators in the system, to the parents who are taking note. I have a 13-year-old, so I take note. And they will tell you that if you are not careful, that technology exposes your child to a range of negativity. Not just content, because you can literally get anything you want to get on it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. But also lifestyle from a health and wellness perspective. So you go home, you go on the game. You know, there are some games now where you play it with 5 or 6 other people in remote parts of the world, or your schoolmate up the road, and they are on it interacting, and they will do it for the entire day. And the only snack they are prepared to engage in is the salty or the sweetie that's stored in a bag, and the sugary drink that has excessive sugar. And all of that leads to the challenges that we are facing. So, Mr. Speaker, I say that to say, member, the policy that you seek to influence in this motion, in a sense, is relatively narrow, though important, and requires a more holistic assessment and approach to solving the problem in a more fulsome way. Because there's a lot more to the health and wellness of our child or children than just access to local foods. And that the policy has to be broadened in that respect. Mr. Speaker, so that's kind of the backdrop. Now the question is, are we recognizing that that problem exists, and what are we doing about it? And this is where I'm prepared to support my Minister of Education, who doesn't sit in this house, but certainly my colleague minister who does, who supports him, and the rest of the government, because we have recognized that. And some of the action that we have taken has attracted commendation, but also criticisms. And one of the challenges I'm putting out to you, member, and to those on that side, we need a united voice once we are convinced that this has to be the approach in terms of the holistic approach to education. So take for example, the development of a food task force that was appointed by myself. I believe the idea was mooted before me. We followed through on it to demonstrate our commitment to that process, because we recognize, based on the health profile of the wider population, that physical activity or inactivity and consumption habits were the major cause of our healthcare issues, which leads to the non-communicable diseases. So the Food Task Force has come up with a report, to fast forward, and has prescribed a range of recommendations to progressively bring us into an age and stage where the consumer becomes a lot more aware and therefore can make informed decisions about what they consume. Where the suppliers of these foods, whether local or imported, are required to do certain things in order to create that awareness and to meet certain standards. So, for example, one example is front of package labeling, where if you go to countries like Chile and several others, consumer is now able to take up a product, imported or otherwise, and front of package labeling tells that consumer exactly what is inside that product and what implications that would be for their consumption of salts, sugars, fats, whatever else. And we have to move in that direction. We have to move in that direction. And where we are now, front of package labeling just means put the labeling of what is the content, the nutritional content of the product on the front of the package, and to use a method to highlight the significance of that nutritional content depending on how nutritious it is. In other words, in Chile they have what is called a stoplight method. And you know what red stands for, what amber stands for, and what green stands for. Green, of course, is the healthy option. All the time. I couldn't help that. but that stoplight method raises the alarm about a product if that product contains nutritional content that could lead to some form of risk, health risk, which of course encourages manufacturers to adjust. So product reformulation follows naturally from consumer awareness, which again is another recommendation. Manufacturers reformulating to provide more nutritional responses to consumer demand for health and wellness. So the government is doing that, and I think that's an important response. Now to the schools in particular, just to jump to that, which is what the motion is about. Member would have recalled, or hopefully recall, that we are taking tangible steps as a government to address the issue of health and wellness in our school system, having recognized the crisis that I have just outlined, containing the data that is here. For one, we have taken on the issue of excessive sugar consumption. And I say excessive sugar consumption just to be absolutely clear, because in recent times I've heard what I consider to be a misinterpretation of what we're trying to do. And maybe we're not communicating enough, so we'll use the opportunity again. We're not saying that consuming certain amounts of sugar is not important and indeed nutritious for you, will help you. In fact, we're also saying that there are sugars and there are sugars. There are natural sugars. When you eat orange, sugar is contained. But then there's added sugars or free sugars. So there's an explanation for it. But having said that, based on the standards that are put out by the World Health Organization, there are guidelines as it relates to daily allowance of free sugars. And the guidelines are clear. It says 2.5 grams per 100 mil. This government has taken a position, member, that given that sugary drink is by far the most popular consumed in the school system, and we have done the checks to show that, we need to control the nutritional content of that product as a starting point. And that is why the government has agreed to go with the gradual reduction of added sugars in the drink that is consumed in the school environment. So what we're effectively doing is sanitizing to the best will that we can that school environment to deal with the issue of sugary drink. But we're doing more than that and more comprehensively finally, and that is the issue of a nutrition policy. The Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education, Youth and Communication is working on a school nutrition policy that we expect to be available by the end of this calendar year, hopefully early in the new year, that will ultimately, through government action, guide what is offered in the school system in terms of a more balanced diet and approach to consumption. In other words, the allocation that the ministry gives to provide this in the school feeding program will be used and influenced by a nutrition policy that will guide how meals are prepared and what is prepared. And to my mind, that is going to be a fundamental shift in terms of what is offered now, and as you rightly pointed out, it's a free-for-all in most cases, and what will be offered in the future, member. And I think that's a very major step in trying to address the issue of nutrition in the school system. And finally, I'd say, member, Mr. Speaker, that this approach to nutrition also has in mind, as was said by the member from Northeast Manchester, a local focus. In fact, part of the introduction of the Jamaica Moves program in schools, which will take place in the months to come, is also partnerships with entities like the 4-H movement. which falls under the minister. The 4-H movement is established in, the last check I was told, well over 1,000 institutions. Between high school and primary school, it's over in excess of 700 4-H clubs. 700 clubs. And they offer critical on-campus leadership in the school garden programs, but it also in terms of general nutrition, discussions, meal preparation, leadership at that level. And one of the things that we intend to do, working with Minister of Education, is to utilize those clubs and societies to not only promote healthy eating, healthy consumption, but also help in promoting the value of work in terms of school gardens and the benefits that flow from that. So remember, I appreciate the motion. I think the motion is timely, given all that is happening. I urge and recommend consideration for a joint approach to supporting some of these initiatives. And I assure you that certainly from a health and wellness perspective, we in the Ministry of Health, working with my colleagues in the Cabinet, have a huge role to play in getting this program on course. And we certainly recognize that it's time to be a lot more assertive, which is why we make the claims that we make and we take on the task at hand. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Green. Minister Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after the intervention of the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Health, I think significant ground has been covered in relation to the approach that the government is taking. Regarding this issue. You'd have heard in the historical overview, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Agriculture highlighted that at some points in our history there appeared to be reluctance in various quarters regarding the move in this direction, as indicated by the member's motion. But I think it is fair to say now, Mr. Speaker, that we are at one in relation to one, increasing the amount of local produce in our school feeding program, and also in relation to the broader health-related issues of our children and students. Mr. Speaker, I, however, just found it necessary not to speak in more general terms, but to highlight some of the initiatives that are presently happening to ensure that we do see that increase in produce. As I think the AG highlighted when we just started the debate on the motion, there is a policy, Mr. Speaker, and the Minister of Agriculture again made reference to it. I think what oftentimes we lack is efficient implementation in that regard. What we are very serious about in the Ministry of Education, Mr. Speaker, is how can we implement those policies that are there, that has significant support, especially on both sides of the aisle. So we have been focused on the implementation. One of the things that we now do, Mr. Speaker, and we've been doing it across administrations, but we are now strengthening our intervention in that regard, is that we have an annual meeting with the operators of our canteens across the school system, Mr. Speaker. A while back we had formulated a manual to utilize local produce in the menu options that are offered in our schools. So what we do each year now, Mr. Speaker, is to reiterate with our canteen operators the possible menu options that can be utilized using local produce. This is very important, Mr. Speaker, and this has been bolstered by an MOU that we signed in 2016, Mr. Speaker, with the 4-H clubs. And that MOU, Mr. Speaker, is to establish school gardens right across our public school system. We are now presently operating in 300 schools, Mr. Speaker, and these school gardens feed directly into the canteen program and the school feeding program. In fact, Mr. Speaker, you will allow me to pause just to speak about what we've been able to achieve at a school in my own constituency, the Newell High School, Mr. Speaker. Not only does it have an active school garden program, which feeds directly into their school feeding program, giving them the ability to not only do lunch, but to do breakfast. What they have been able to do, Mr. Speaker, is through partnership with Grace Kennedy, that operates the Hounslow processing plant. They have now developed such skill through their agricultural department that they farm peppers and sell to Grace Kennedy. So they make an excess that goes into our production market, Mr. Speaker. In fact, last year they told me they made profits in excess of $600,000 that they now plow back in to their school system and their school feeding program. So while I do appreciate it, I think one of the members made the point that school gardens oftentimes are limited. There are some schools that have significant amounts of land that if they were to take a strategic approach, not only will the garden subsidize the school feeding program, but can go to subsidize the delivery of education. And that is what we're doing at the Newell High School. We continue, Mr. Speaker, to have various programs to help our primary and secondary schools. But one of the things that we recognize coming in as a government, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to encourage more of our schools to provide cooked meals. And that is part of what has been, I would say, a significant shift in our policy in relation to our school feeding program. The shift has been, Mr. Speaker, to provide more resources so that cooked meals can be provided, because we recognize when the schools do have functioning canteens that they operate and can provide cooked meals, they use much more local produce. What we recognize at the primary level, Mr. Speaker, a number of primary schools had canteen facilities, but not the resources to pay for their chefs. So what we determined to do, and we did it last year, and we're doing it again this year, and it is now a policy of the ministry, Mr. Speaker, is that the government now pays for all the cooks across our primary schools across Jamaica. Last year we put $274 million towards that, Mr. Speaker. This year we're putting $323 million, and we will pay for 1,007 cooks across our primary schools. What we also did, Mr. Speaker, when we did the survey for the schools that were not utilizing their canteens because unfortunately they had not been maintained and that they were run down, Mr. Speaker, and for the schools that did not have canteens, we have now programmed resources to get canteen facilities into those schools. Last year, Mr. Speaker, we put $120 million and we effected repairs to canteen equipment and purchased new equipment in 306 schools. This year, Mr. Speaker, we've programmed $105 million to provide funding for 269 schools to deal with their canteen repairs. You would have heard the Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker, speak about the need to increase the resources in relation to the per capita spend on the provision of meals. And also our opposition spokesperson, a member from Central Kingston, in his opening also raised that the level of the spend is inadequate. I think we all agree. It has been inadequate, Mr. Speaker. And I think once there is agreement across the floor that we have to continue to increase this allocation, it is something that we must have a united voice upon. And I have heard the Minister of Agriculture, and we welcome that the lobby will be even stronger in relation to increasing the amount that we put into the school feeding program. But, Mr. Speaker, significant strides have been made. In 2016, Mr. Speaker, what we found at the early childhood level in relation to the allocation for school feeding per child was $40 per student. In 2017, Mr. Speaker, we raised that to $90 per student. And this year, Mr. Speaker, we are raising that to $150 per student at the early childhood level, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we will be contributing $381 million to the school feeding program in the early childhood system. And again, I don't have to stress the importance of how important it is at the early years. There is still a far way to go, Mr. Speaker, and we still have to continue to monitor the system in relation to what it is spent on. But at that level, most of the products that are bought to provide cooked meals for the children. But we will continue, Mr. Speaker, to monitor. Mr. Speaker, we continue to provide support at the primary and secondary school levels. And you would have heard the Minister of Health reference some of the research in relation to Nutritional Products Limited. And one of the things that once we went in, Mr. Speaker, we did look to see the market that was being provided among the school system by Nutritional Products Limited. And we did poll the system to see what is the preference in relation to our school feeding program. Over 80, almost 90% of our schools, Mr. Speaker, said the preference was that the subsidy be provided to them so that they could purchase items and provide cooked meals, instead of what was done previously regarding the provision of snacks and the provisions of meals from the NPL. And that is the direction that we have gone in, Mr. Speaker. I think all our mission is to provide a hot meal 5 times per week. I've heard the member who is suggesting that we should go even further and look not to provide 1 meal, but to provide 2 meals. We are on the journey, Mr. Speaker. And I think we are almost at a point where, with the continued support across agriculture and the Ministry of Health, that we can say that at least we will be able to attain the providing a hot meal for each child in our system that are needy, Mr. Speaker, each day per week. I will close, Mr. Speaker, by saying by firstly thanking all the private sector entities that continue to support our school feeding program. One of the things that we did, Mr. Speaker, we gave a call when we came in as a government, indicating the shortfall in resources, and a number of our private sector companies have come forward and have put significant resources into our school feeding program. And outside of that formal assistance, Mr. Speaker, I think all of us in this House, we know of a number of people who support our schools in that school feeding program, and it is important. But I have to mention what Scotiabank is doing with us, Mr. Speaker. We have partnered with the Scotiabank Foundation under their Nutrition for Life program. And what we did this summer, Mr. Speaker, was to bring in the chefs and the cooks across a number of our primary schools, to have them interact with Jackie Tyson so she could show them very cheap, innovative ways of using local produce in their menus each day. I think that is part of the important mission that we have to do. I don't think it's an unwillingness, Mr. Speaker. I think right across the board, people recognize that the more local produce is infused in our school system, it's better for our students, it's better for our communities. I think we have to continue informing the market, informing our school leaders of creative, cost-effective ways of making this happen. And across our ministry, Mr. Speaker, we will continue along that journey. I thank you.
Permission to speak from a seat other than my own.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I wanted to join my voice to those who have been discussing the motion moved by the member from Central Kingston, and I certainly want to thank him for placing the matter on the agenda and providing an opportunity for us to look a little bit more deeply on what is happening in terms of nutrition in our schools, and to have members from both sides discuss what is happening, what is being done, and where we need to go. As I sat listening to the discussion, I was reminded of the number of discussions I've been having, certainly with the leadership of schools within Southwest St. Andrew. And as I spoke to them, and as I spoke also to some of the teachers that I know who are also involved in schools outside of the constituency, the overriding imperative that I saw was an acknowledgement that a feeding program is an absolute necessity in far too many of our schools. So when the member from Central Kingston speaks about 2 meals per day, for some schools it's okay, 1 meal is sufficient, because when those children go home, they are okay. But for others, when they go home, they are not assured of another meal. And so I also want to ask us to look not just across the board at what we do, but to look at the schools and the population and the makeup of who we have there and what are the needs. Because we do say that education has to be child-centered, and therefore in this case I would want us to look at that as well. Over the years, and I'm pleased to hear the additional appeal that was made to our corporate neighbors, but I am well aware over the years of the tremendous contribution that is being made and has been made by our corporate neighbors, in particular as it relates to our school feeding program. Because without some of them, we could not have a successful feeding program in many, many of our schools. So when we talk about the program, the feeding program, yes, it has to be nutritious, it has to be balanced, but it also has to be available. So when I hear the minister speak about, Minister Green, that is speak about what they're doing in schools and the request from principals to give them the allocation so that they could provide that meal, I also want us to be clear that if what we give them is not sufficient to provide for all the students who are in need for the number of days that we're expecting them to come to school, then we are not doing enough. And I just believe that we are at a point in our history when history is calling on us to ensure that our children who are in our schools are fed. because we already know that for them to make the most of the education that they come to school for, if they are hungry, it will be almost a waste of time. The wonderful program that the Minister of Health speaks about, Jamaica Moves, and bringing that to school, fine, I want to see. But I also am very well aware that an empty bag can't move, can't stand, much less move. And so again, even for that to be the kind of success we would want it to be, we need to ensure that our children are fed. And I think that that has to be a commitment, a basic commitment that is made to our children, so that whatever the program is, our children who are in school, who are depending on that little meal from school, that they know that it can be guaranteed. It provides also, I hear us talking, but provides also an excellent opportunity to show what joined up government is really about, between agriculture, between health, education, industry. Because the other thing we should not forget is that our teachers, our chefs, our students, and our parents are but a microcosm of a broader society, where foreign mind is the order of the day, where we have already placed our local produce and local taste at the back of the line. And so what that means is that it requires a greater level of nutritional education amongst those stakeholder groupings for them to actually come on board in the kind of way that is going to make a difference. But make no mistake, it is something that is absolutely, absolutely needed. I am extremely pleased that in 2018, all of us are speaking about eating what we grow and growing what we eat. I am still old enough to remember when I was living on Oxford Street in the 70s, my parents growing some of what we were eating and eating some of what we were growing. I'm not sure how many of us in this room would have been on that train supporting eating what we grow and growing what we eat. But any time that we come on board is good enough. And it is absolutely good to see that we are all on board in 2018. But it is something that we have to continue to push. I also wanted to make sure, as we speak, that there are some other programs that are simple programs that are already in existence that I believe we can pull in. I am certain that many of us inside here as members of parliament help our schools in so many different ways. We have the program through RADA, for example. And I believe that what we need to see is a greater kind of synergy through programs like those that makes it a little easier, whether it is the backyard garden, the school garden, backyard garden at school, or in the homes, or in the community, that those two can become part of it. I heard the minister speaking about a warm meal. When I heard the Minister of Agriculture talking about all the various products that were being manufactured from local produce, I smiled and I said, it is good that we recognize, as the world is pushing for healthier options, that these are there. But I hope we also understand that that is almost a niche market that we're talking to, that there are a number of individuals who can afford it who are going there. But there are many individuals who believe that they cannot afford it, and so they do not see these as some of their options. And so part of what we have to do is to make sure we bring them so that they understand that this too can be an option for them. So as we're talking about healthy, I want to throw one other healthy option into the mix. We have a program with RADA with chickens. And many of our schools, I've seen MPs help schools to set up these schools so that chicken can be an activity at school that helps to subsidize what happens there. But the option we give them still relies in large measure on a lot of chemicals. And I'd love for us to begin to look at how we provide a more organic option, even for the rearing of these birds that will become part of that feeding program or become part of the program that individuals in our community put out into that market. Because I believe that if we are talking about a healthy lifestyle, we have to live it, and it has to be manifest in all the other programs and in all the other things that we do. I also I like the idea of having this kind of joint support, because I believe that the parents need to be pulled also a little bit more into the program in terms of what their role is, in terms of not just the chefs understanding what are the options for low-cost nutritious meals, but that the parents also are made aware, are sensitized, are exposed to these nutritious, healthy, local options. I believe that today is a wonderful opportunity for us to refocus on that, and I accept and I'm pleased to hear what is happening. But I believe that we need to understand that our children demand a faster pace than we are moving. A faster pace. There are some students in some schools that will be able to make do with what we are doing because the parents and support group have the kind of resources to help. There are far too many schools that rely only on what government has to offer to make it a reality. And I believe that we need to pay far more attention to those individuals and those schools and to help them in a way to begin to even that scale. And so, with these few words, I sit. But I really want to make sure that as we speak, we understand that it's not one Jamaica we are speaking to. That in the same way the quality of education differs depending on the school that you go, the quality and level of the nutrition also differs depending on where you are. And it is up to us inside this room to make sure that those who are least able to do it on their own, that we give them the support to have a leg up. Thank you.
Reverend Tweeds. Mr. Speaker, isn't it a nice thing for the House to betake itself to discuss a matter of urgent national priority, which has often been thrust into the background, and to do so in a spirit of collaboration rather than competition, and for us to be able to, by this debate and what I hope will follow, present the country with an encouragement towards what the Minister calls a radical change in an area that is so critical to individual life and social upliftment. So I'm very happy at the way the debate has proceeded, and thank everyone who has participated. Mr. Speaker, I'm fully aware of the Ministry Paper 40 of 2013, which was the tabling of the Food and Nutrition Security Policy. Any close reading of this, which is what preceded the motion that I filed over a year and many months ago, Mr. Speaker, noted that while we set out a very important guideline, we didn't do anything about it. That's why I brought it. And the policy itself calls for the development of further policy which is why I phrased it in the way that I did. The policy, I'm referring to page 23 now, only to pinch ourselves to make sure that we do what we say we know is valuable. It says government shall enact a food security law. Where is that, Mr. Speaker? From 2013, this is 2018 now, 5 years on such an important issue, and that's not in sight. It goes further, you know. It says that the law will be supported, this law will be supported by appropriate production and trade policies. That's what we're calling for. To increase production and productivity of the domestic agriculture and agro-processing sectors. Listen to this, Mr. Speaker. And protect local industries from unfair external competition. Not chiding anybody, you know, sir. There's enough blame to go around. All we want to do is to remind ourselves what is needed and to make sure that we resolve in a united way to achieve it now. It goes on to set an exciting target. It says, to the extent feasible, listen to this, sir, at least 75% of all food purchases made by government, directly or by public entities, that includes school, you know, shall be from domestic or regional food production. Yes? So that's the context in which we really have to provoke ourselves to act very quickly and very resolutely at this stage. In respect of school feeding, it states, page 38 of the policy, early childhood institutions, primary and secondary schools, preparation and implementation of a national comprehensive school nutrition policy. I'm very glad to hear that that is nearby. Yes. In fact, the preliminary work was done, headed by Dr. Samuda, with I think it was a USAID grant, which was nearing completion, to my best knowledge, at the end of 2015. Support for the development of curricula at different levels of the education system that include nutrition and health education for making lifestyle choices. Minister of Health, that's something we have to betake ourselves to right now. That's very important. That will support the take-up of the expansive production scenario which the Minister of Agriculture states. Listen to this. Development of national guidelines for the preparation and sale to children of school meals that promote health and wellness. Now, I know that's planned, but Mr. Speaker, let us view all of this in the context of our realities. One of the most difficult and controversial things that exists in the school system now is the fact of the fast food cafeterias, the canteens. Mr. Speaker, I don't think that's a good thing. What's happening, I'm sure the Ministry of Education knows, and the Ministry of Social Security ought to also, that the children are taking the $150 and presenting it to the concessionaire and being asked to pay the added $200 or $150 in order to get the fast food choice, because that's what's available and that's the preference, of course, that they have. That, with all good intentions, is not the way we want to go. I want to point out that the survey of living conditions for last year speaks of the school feeding program. I'm on page 322, and it states that under the IDB integrated support to Jamaica's social protection strategy project, there is a school feeding policy completed, it says, for review prior to submission for cabinet. And here are the canons of the policy. Facilitate the development of guidelines for increased access to safe and nutritionally adequate food in schools. Facilitate a greater focus on physical activity. Facilitate the development of healthy eating and lifestyle choices, and contribute to improvements in the nutritional education knowledge of children and their families. All worthy, but not one of them relating to local production, Minister. Yes? Because the member from Southwest is absolutely correct. We have to face it. We have a foreign mind as far as food is concerned. Many of us. And I am convinced, while there is need, Minister of Health, for a phasing in of this product. No one is suggesting that by some alchemy we could replace imported food in the school feeding program in 1 year, or even in 3 or 5 years. There has to be definite targets that are set, related to production, related to economy, but we have to start with the presumption that the food security policy itself states that our local production can in fact provide nutritious food economically for our children. Many of us do not accept that yet. There is no suggestion that we should banish rice and flour. But Minister of Agriculture, you made such an important contribution about the sweet potato, because what we could do with the sweet potatoes, the member from Southern Manchester, his constituency and many others can grow 6-week sweet potato, you know. And I'm sure that the nutritional value of that product can be vouched for and can, in the ways that we've had very helpfully shown to us in those samples today, make a nearly immediate improvement to the amount of local produce that we are using. We have to have the will to do it, and it has to have the resolve of this government and indeed of this parliament to go in that direction. Otherwise, take it from me, I remember the efforts. Every excuse will be given for continuing exactly as we are. Yes? Every excuse will be given. And therefore, our resolve has to be intentional, that we're going to change these things in steadily increasing levels over the next few years. Mr. Speaker, the samples are wonderful. The problem is, how do we now move the samples into the schools? And it seems to me we have to do a cost-benefit analysis. That's been inherent in the helpful speeches of so many members. Of course, it's going to cost us more to provide local ingredients for our school feeding program. It's going to cost us more, at least in the first instance, until we ramp up all kinds of production. But the net effect is going to be virtuous throughout the entire economy. That is the truth. And if we take that kind of longer look, I think we will be prepared to make the requisite investment. Mr. Speaker, in terms of fruits, I'm appreciating the shift in the axis of policy from the nutrition products outgoings to the school canteens. Why is it not possible for us to provide our students local fruit in the mornings when they come? Why is it that we can't stimulate the banana industry? Why is it so much mango must go to waste? So much pawpaw, so much melon, so much what a principal calls Ethiopia apples, but we know something else. Yes? Why is it that we can't intentionally say to our schools, to our Parent-Teachers Association, because I agree with the member that we must engage the parents in this odyssey that we are upon, in order that we begin that process. Mr. Speaker, I'm imploring the Minister. He spoke about the very developed level of chicken meat production in Jamaica. We know that that is based upon foreign ingredients for the food. But Mr. Minister, don't sign any more license for the chicken neck and back, sir. Stimulate the local industry in order to produce something that is going to enhance the protein. Yes? That has been a racket and an unnecessary one for many, many years. We don't need to do that. We need to be intentional. Our neighbors in Cuba satisfied their protein needs for a long while by the cultivation of rabbit and the use of rabbit meat. It is ironic that the tourists who come from Europe to Jamaica enjoy rabbit, yes? But we are reticent to use it as a staple. There are many things that if we are determined, we will be able to engage in this regard. I salute the effort to transform the sugar lands that are no longer economical into food and vegetable production systems. Begging you though, sir, that the journeymen and the political satraps who will knock on your door to get the land must not be the ones to be favored, except their capacity to produce, and their sustainability is going to be there. The transparent nature of this is of great importance. It is one of our precious assets that has been used in untoward ways for so long. It's going to be an expensive process, or a more expensive process. $150 a day simply won't cut it at this time. But if we are prepared to invest more so that we can get better outcomes from our children, I implore the government to consider the standardization and the universality of breakfast. Many of our students in a school system which is not zoned come from far distances from home to school. Many of them leave. Every MP here is aware of the children in our constituencies who travel in excess of 20, 40 miles to school. It is impossible for them to have been given breakfast before, nutritious enough to sustain them for that journey and then for the day in school until lunchtime. Breakfast is critical not only for humane and compassionate purposes, but for the success of the educational enterprise, which is costing us so much. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Health asked whether my figure of 80% related to the school canteen offerings or to nutrition products. In fact, it is higher with the nutrition products. It is more like 90 and 95% of imports. At the school level, it is lower. It is more like 80%. That's why I used it, because I'm hoping that that will become more ubiquitous. And I think that if there is distinct policy that says, look, wherever possible, you must try to use local produce. That encouragement alone, supported by all of the nutritional information, will make a difference. The food security, National Food and Nutrition Security Policy, Mr. Speaker, calls for an interministerial committee on food security. I'd like to know at some point whether that is active, because it seems to me that the point made by the member from Southwest is very important, that the 4 ministries that are most intimately concerned do have some coordination that they will allow for the implementation of this project. I'm concluding by hoping that this will be a spark that continues through the stubble of our national concern and blazes into new projects, new elements of implementation, new refinement of policy. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to amend the resolution with the House's permission to refer these deliberations and the issue of local produce in school feeding to an appropriate committee of Parliament to expand discourse informed by what we have said here. I am still in some doubt as to whether it should be economy and production or it should be human resources. I would take advice on that. I think it's economy and production. And if it so pleases the House and the resolution could be amended to allow for that, it would be a fitting climax to what we have done over a couple of days of useful debate. My suggestion then, Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, would be that the last paragraph of the resolution would read amended as follows: be it resolved that this Honourable House debate the implementation of policy of increased use of local produce in the school feeding program and refer this issue to the Economy and Production Committee for further discourse and to monitor effectiveness. May it please you.
Mr. Speaker.
House Leader, I want to ask that the amendment be approved. Those in favor? Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Speaker, would you put the motion then as amended before the House? I believe that's the next thing to be done.
I put the motion now as amended. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, he read it already.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. So we are now going to move to the next item, and that is the debate that is to continue on the private member's motion number 59, standing in the name of the member from Central St. James.
Dr. Guy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the resolution moved by the member from St. James Central. St. James Central, which speaks to the issue of the National Housing Trust and its contributors, and as per the resolution, its inequity to those who contribute. Mr. Speaker, Capri did a study in 2016, and which was also borne out by the Task Force on the National Housing Trust, which indicated that the National Housing Trust gives more benefits to those who contribute least to it. The highest numbers of benefits go to the middle and upper income, and the majority of beneficiaries are not in the poorest income group. As I said, the middle and upper income have received more mortgages than those in the lower income group. And contributors earning $20,000 and above per week were twice as likely to get mortgages as contributors earning less than $10,000 per week. Mr. Speaker, this matter has been something that has occupied the minds of many parliamentarians for a period of time. In fact, I'm sorry the member from Kingston Central has left, because he has advocated on many occasions that members of his constituencies and other people in inner city communities have approached the National Housing Trust, and they are not able to satisfy some of the requirements that are needed. Some that their proof of ownership, titles, but we know, Mr. Speaker, that some of these persons live on land that has been there in their family for a long period of time. And sometimes they approach the trust for funding to help to build what little they have or to improve on what little they have, and sweat equity from themselves and the community would be used as part of it, but they are not able to access some of the benefits from the National Housing Trust. And it is something that is not only confined to Central Kingston. There are pockets all over the country, whether rural or urban, which would seek to be beneficiaries of such a relief. Mr. Speaker, there are many rural folks who are contributing to the National Housing Trust simply because it is mandatory, but they are not able to get a benefit. And when there's a benefit that usually is available, it is taken up by those who are at a higher income earning bracket. They have a point system which allows people to be able to benefit, but it is my humble suggestion, Mr. Speaker, that the National Housing Trust needs to have a revisit at this point system so that it can be skewed favorably for those persons who are the lower income bracket in the community. You know, Mr. Speaker, sometimes it's not the regulations or the act that needs amendment. Sometimes the policy of the management of the National Housing Trust. And I will share something with you, Mr. Speaker. The resolution spoke to the upfront cost that is required, amounting to 9.5–10% that is needed to be paid. You have the transfer tax, which is borne by the vendor, but is usually part of the 10% deposit. The stamp duty 4% and the registration 0.5% in total, 9.5%. But do you know, Mr. Speaker, and I am, as the member from St. Mary Western, the member from St. Mary Western would tell you that his granny would tell him that donkey said the world on a level. You see, Mr. Speaker, the National Housing Trust has a system where when they do develop housing schemes, they will allow a purchaser 100% mortgage, as well as make a commitment to pay the deposit of 10%. They have come a far way. They have reached that area, that stage. So technically what they are doing is what the member from St. James Central is asking. They are upfronting the deposit as well as 100% mortgage for a scheme that is developed by them. But Mr. Speaker, if that purchaser is buying on the open market, there's no provision for that. They have to find that 10% for down payment, even to get that 100% mortgage. So, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that that particular situation could be obviated if the National Housing Trust, just like how it gives a commitment letter to pay the 10%, could also give that commitment letter or that letter of undertaking to the attorney acting on behalf of the purchaser that the National Housing Trust would pay. Give an example, Mr. Speaker. I am buying in a private development. I approach the National Housing Trust and they say that, yes, I'm buying for $10 million. The National Housing Trust will give me the mortgage with my co-contributor for $10 million. But what the National Housing Trust needs to do, because I don't have that 10% deposit, is to also give me a letter of undertaking to take to my attorney. So when I'm signing that contract, that is provided by the vendor's attorney, that 10% that I will be required to down pay is undertaken by that letter that the National Housing Trust gives to me. Just like when they are doing a development on their own and they are selling to the purchasers out there. So, Mr. Speaker, a simple policy change from management could effect and put some equity in what we are having there, Mr. Speaker. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that there's a need for the National Housing Trust to start thinking outside the box. The reality is that a lot of our Jamaicans look to the trust for benefits that they don't get. Yes, they give grants to some people that you don't pay back. They give all sorts of things, but you need to expand that. And I'm happy that the Prime Minister mentioned earlier on that we are going to be having a debate on the recommendations of that review of the National Housing Trust, because there are some issues that we need to articulate, not only in terms of the funding generally and what you do with the reserves or whatever is there, but how you tackle the problem of people trying to access housing. So, Mr. Speaker, my contribution is going to be mainly reserved for that particular time, but I just want to support the resolution move, because there are simple things that can be done to assist the public, the small contributor out there the persons earning less than $10,000 per week, the persons who do not have time, the young professional who does not have years to amass that deposit. Things that can be done to assist the people, because if we are about our people achieving a certain level of growth and development, then certainly national institutions have to be brought into play in their role in national development. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Hinton.
Mr. Speaker, that I had intended to take part in the debate on this motion. However, Mr. Speaker, in my absence last week I was advised, and it was repeated here again, that the Most Honourable Prime Minister has indicated that a debate will be entertained on the report, the NHT report, that has been tabled in this House later this year. It is one of the central recommendations I made in my presentation, that the substantive report, which I've had the opportunity to review, that report was so rich in its recommendation that it would benefit the House and the country to have a fulsome debate on that report. I'm very pleased to see that the Prime Minister has agreed that such a debate will take place this side of the year, and therefore it makes it unnecessary, I believe, because many of the thrust of what the mover of this motion was seeking to do, I think, is encompassed in that report. And I do believe that report, a fulsome debate on that report, will meet to a large extent. In fact, I believe it will meet and exceed your intention in bringing forward this particular motion. And so, instead of entering on that reference twice, I think I'll await and prepare for that debate to come, because I think it will be very beneficial to the House and to the country, the nation as a whole. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I rest until such time when that debate is brought forward. Thank you.
Minister Robinson.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as elected representatives, we interact with constituents who often bemoan their existing housing situation, and they express frustrations at the difficulty they encounter in seeking to access housing through the National Housing Trust. For too many of our people, Mr. Speaker, particularly the working poor, the dream of owning their home has remained precisely that, a dream. These people are uncomfortable with their current housing arrangements. Many are tired of being deemed squatters, existing on the periphery in what is deemed an informal settlement. Many are tired of the onerous rent obligations, an obligation which wipes out a considerable portion of the disposable income of many working Jamaicans. And then there are those who have outgrown the meager and cramped accommodations of a residence occupied by members of their extended family, which often sees 6, 7, or even 10 people living in a very small space. So ideally, Mr. Speaker, our people shouldn't have to encounter this kind of indignity. But it must be that much more offensive and depressing for those among us who diligently go out to work and put in a lot of effort to better provide for themselves and their families, but simply cannot access the means of home ownership. Mr. Speaker, I have the distinct privilege of representing the people of Northeast St. Ann. Among them, and most of them, are resourceful, diligent, and industrious Jamaicans who have been steadfast, providing bread for their families by the sweat of their brow. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that I speak of craft vendors, artisans, security guards, hospital porters, nurses, hotel workers, civil servants, teachers, police officers, ancillary workers, and a host of others. Many of them, Mr. Speaker, are amongst the working poor. It is against this backdrop that I rise this afternoon in support of a motion moved by the member from Central St. James. I do so out of a sense of duty, conviction, and empathy, Mr. Speaker. For those of us who are on the ground interfacing with our constituents day after day, week after week, we observe it. We see their plight. We observe their frustrations, and we hear their concerns. Mr. Speaker, the matter of inadequate access to housing is not unique to Central St. James or St. Northeast. Indeed, it is not a Northeast St. problem or a Central St. James problem. It is a Jamaica problem. It is an issue that straddles all 63 constituencies, and it is an issue that we have to better respond to and treat in a responsible way. This issue of access to housing for contributors who have been struggling to access a benefit is one for sober contemplation and responsible action. This is not an issue for empty sloganeering and populism, promising free land and free housing when we know fully well that neither is affordable nor sustainable. We mustn't join that chorus. We must resist any inclination to be populist or disingenuous in this regard. What we must be about, Mr. Speaker, is creatively bringing the weight of the state and our collective political will to bear in devising and implementing strategies that will better accommodate those contributors who have been finding it particularly difficult, onerous, or virtually impossible to access a benefit. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me in contributing to the debate on this motion to not acknowledge the admirable efforts of the National Housing Trust in pursuit of its mandate to build houses and communities for the benefit of its contributors. Much has been done, Mr. Speaker. All I'm saying is that it is time to do even more. Mr. Speaker, the Most Honourable Prime Minister was quite right in observing that after 40 years of existence, a strategic interrogation of the NHT was necessary. Institutions should indeed be revisited, assessed, and if needs be, repurposed from time to time. In fact, the very mandate of an institution may have to be revised if it is to remain relevant, agile, and effective. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's directive to the then NHT chairman, now Minister of Finance, was timely and appropriate, and we commend them both. By making reference to the admirable work of the NHT over the years, and particularly in more recent times, Mr. Speaker, I speak of such pro-poor initiatives as Build on Own Land, Low-Income Housing Grant, 0% interest for contributors earning less than $12,000 per week, increase in the loan ceiling, and a discounted interest rate for public sector workers, to name a few. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the biggest criticisms of the NHT is that its loan ceiling at various points in time have not kept pace with the housing market, especially the cost at which units are available for sale on the open market or by private developers. This is a particularly tough challenge, as there is likely to be a material disparity between NHT loan ceilings or loan amounts and the actual cost of a unit, be it newly developed or existing on the open market. A creative way of addressing this issue and bringing home ownership within the reach of the poorest contributors is by re-examining the cost at which solutions are coming to market and rethinking the very notion of a unit. What I'm getting at here, Mr. Speaker, is that here in Jamaica, the conventional notion of a house is a structure comprising block and mortar. But we know that there are other types of solutions and fabrications that can be applied in the construction and delivery of units to NHT contributors. Lest there are those who may misconstrue this suggestion and think I'm speaking of housing solutions that are not befitting the dignity of a working man or woman, I must hasten to point out that I'm referring to some of the more contemporary, though modest, ways of building. These are not necessarily block and mortar, but are quite sturdy, effective, and aesthetically pleasing, and could go a far way in meeting the housing needs of our population of NHT contributors. Mr. Speaker, these kinds of solutions may be made available to our hardworking and deserving lower income NHT contributors at prices that may be significantly lower than the fabricated concrete solutions that we have grown more accustomed to. As such, Mr. Speaker, whatever down payment requirements there may be considerably lower than that of the more traditional housing solutions and therefore more within the reach of the working poor. Another area for focused attention, Mr. Speaker, in addressing this vexing issue of the inability to take up an NHT benefit due to onerous down payment requirements is a matter of financial literacy and a culture of thrift and saving. Whilst I readily recognize that there are those among us whose meager earnings hardly takes them to the next paycheck, let alone accommodate savings, I find that there is a general paucity of financial literacy and consumer savvy amongst our people. Even basic things such as shopping around for least cost or lower cost debt escapes many of our people. We know all too well the stories of those who run into problems with the infamous loan sharks. Too many of our people attend to their wants and desires before attending to their needs. Too many of our people fail to set aside something in the formal financial system that they can fall back on in times of financial difficulty or resort to when the opportunity arises for a strategic investment or personal development through, for example, the purchase of a house or the pursuit of higher education. Recent statistics tell us that we have too many unbanked people in our population. Financial inclusion, or better yet, the lack thereof, is an issue we need to address, and address with considerable alacrity and purpose. It is not rocket science, Mr. Speaker. Generally speaking, greater financial literacy and consumer savvy fosters a culture of thrift and financial prudence amongst people. The kind of prudence that may put more low-income NHT contributors in a position to access a benefit by being able to actually come up with a down payment. There are other creative and fit-for-purpose approaches that may be employed in better addressing the difficulties confronting many low-income NHT contributors as they seek to secure a benefit and meet the down payment required in purchasing a house. And NHT may consider increasing its low-income housing grant. The NHT may consider expanding the categories of persons eligible for a low-income housing grant. A regime regarding the waiver of the down payment requirement for specific categories of contributors may also be devised. A regime for staggering or varying the required down payment may be devised for specific categories of contributors. And the provision of intergenerational mortgages may also bring the prospect of home ownership more within the reach of lower income NHT contributors. Mr. Speaker, Jamaicans are not expecting the NHT or the government to build their dream homes. All they want is the opportunity to acquire land or start a unit, and they will do the rest. Mr. Speaker, as we seek to restore public order, affordable housing solutions must be a part of this equation, must be a part of this thrust, so that we will have communities that can be better monitored by all the social workers, health workers, and security personnel, because we have communities that the social workers nor the security personnel cannot access. And we believe that with formal communities being established, people will have a sense of pride, they will have a sense of belonging, and we know that once persons have a mortgage in their hands, they can leverage it in a bank and get more money to do what they want to do and to reach acquired prosperity that they seek. So, Mr. Speaker, having said this, I support the motion, and I hope that NHT will heed the call of the member of Central.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this evening to support the resolution brought by the member from Central St. James. I want first of all to congratulate him, because what he has done is true representation of our people. We, believe in prosperity, and I'm over here for sure, and I know on the other side you believe in prosperity. And prosperity is about good housing, good health, and good education. And the truth is, I have somebody very practically, a lovely housing scheme came right within his reach. And we had the blessing of the housing trust. He was going to go ahead, but he just did not afford the deposit or the front end things. Now, my concern, because it is obvious we all agree that this ought to be done. But you know, they say justice delayed is justice denied. I would like to think that we not debate this and debate it forever. What I would like to see us do as a parliament is to get quickly to have the policy changed, because there are lots of schemes, there are lots of houses, and there are lots of people who want to experience the prosperity. A man's house is his castle. And the member spoke about the report from the housing trust. I look forward to that also, because there are situations now, and that I know of clearly, and I congratulate the Housing Trust for what they have done, but there needs to be major policy changes. We have people who have bought lands. They have like an indenture, common law indenture. They bought it a long time. They want to finish their homes. They go to the Housing Trust. They provide all the information that you want. When your mother born, when you're dead, everything about you. And your loan is approved. And then hereafter they say to you, your loan is approved, but because of the policies in place and the statute, you cannot get the disbursement of this money until a certain time lapses, because it is a indenture and it is this, and there are all sorts of little clauses that prevent you from accessing the facility. My point, I join with all the points made, but my emphasis is that we do not debate and talk, because we need action for people if we really intend to give them the prosperity they deserve. So I want to really congratulate the member from Central St. James, because what he's talking about is what is real. It's what's on the ground. Because in politics and representation, it's about dealing with people. And that is what he has brought to the House. And I think it is now up to us as a parliament not to debate forever. Let us not deny the people the rights they have to housing, and let us get the act together. And I trust that the debate with the Housing Trust, because I'm concerned about other measures that say people who have their indentures and their loans approved. What sense does it make if your loan is approved if you can't get the money? It is even more frustrating, because you have gone through the process, you have been told that the funds have been approved, and you can't get it to move forward. So I say, as a parliament, let us work, and I want to support the resolution, congratulate the member from Central St. James, and I would like to think that we will congratulate all ourselves if we move speedily to ensure that the people of Jamaica enjoy true prosperity through housing. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Stewart. From St. James Central, and to say, Mr. Speaker, that it has become even more important in the rainy season here that we are experiencing. Because when I go through my constituency of South Manchester, we have not had a government scheme. And the residents, especially yesterday when I visited, tears came to my eyes when I saw so many of them in the deplorable condition in their respective houses. Many of them have worked assiduously over the years. They have made contribution to the NHT, and yet still they have not been able to benefit from meaningful housing projects. And so your intervention, member, is quite timely, quite most fitting and quite appropriate, And I believe that as a parliament we should move to see that we have proper housing for our citizens in this country. And so I support the motion most wholeheartedly and look forward to the Prime Minister's debate when the time comes so we can see development taking place, not only in the urban areas, but more so in the rural areas where many of us are from. I thank you.
Mr. Green. Speaker, I rise to support the motion of the member from Central St. James. And I won't detain the House for long, Mr. Speaker, but you must recognize that the perspective from which I speak is one of the young Jamaican who dreams of owning their own house, who each day, Mr. Speaker, is faced with a reality that appears that that home ownership dream is out of their reach. Mr. Speaker, I commend the Prime Minister on the significant steps that have been taken with the NHT. The raising of the loan threshold to ensure that more can be contributed, and the strategic review of the institution. And I look forward to the continued reforms, Mr. Speaker. But there are two aspects that I will raise briefly. One, the motion, Mr. Speaker. I believe without a doubt we should move to a system where the NHT has the power to either cover the cost of the deposit where contributors are deemed suitable, eligible, or as the member has suggested, where those deposit payments are staggered, Mr. Speaker. Too many, I've seen it in my law practice, too many, especially young Jamaicans, who have worked, have contributed, have served their time in relation to the mandatory period of contributions, have found a place, sometimes not even their ideal location, but they have qualified for all the requirements to get the additional mortgage. But what is left is for them to come up with the 2 million, 3 million, 5 million, 1 million to make that down payment. And their dreams are extinguished, Mr. Speaker. So I join with the member from South Trelawney. The time to move on this matter is now. Because as we speak, there's a young person who probably went to the NHT today and is contemplating how will they come up with the deposit for the house. But there's another issue that I think the NHT should also look into. The issue of our young professionals, our young people who leave college, leave universities, looking to go into the market, maybe not to own, but to rent somewhere, and have a difficulty finding affordable places to rent. Mr. Speaker, Capri had done a study and made some proposals, I think it was 2016 or 2017, in relation to the NHT getting into the rental market. I want to commend that proposal to the House. I believe as one of the solutions, Mr. Speaker, for those who are not yet in a position to own their own house, but they're having a difficulty finding appropriate places to rent, especially in urban Jamaica, where a lot of our young people come to in search of better, and oftentimes end up, Mr. Speaker, finding less than suitable housing in areas that put them in significant detriment. I think the NHT should consider how can they develop solutions in relation to rentals, especially targeting our young professionals. And the final thing, in a lot of NHT schemes, special allocation are made for various persons, civil servants, teachers, which I support. But again, I think we should look towards our youth, Mr. Speaker. Again, I find more of my peers have to be thinking about home ownership as a distant goal in their 40s and 50s. I think in some of our NHT schemes, there should be a special allocation for that part of the population that we consider youth, Mr. Speaker, which in accordance with our youth policy goes up onto 29 years. I think special allocation for our youth, special provisions in our NHT schemes. But I close by again saying, I support the member wholeheartedly. I think this is a very good motion. I think this is something that I would love to see the House act upon and the NHT act upon with speed.
Permission to speak from a seat other than my own. No. Thank you.
Permission granted, Dr. Brownberg.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I speak as I am moved in this House, always remembering that I have a mandate from the citizens of Southwest St. Andrew. I therefore could not sit and not add a word or two on this motion that speaks to the National Housing Trust and making sure that loans are more accessible to individuals who right now are finding it difficult to have. In fact, I had intended to be short. Yes. Right, I had intended to be short before I was provoked. Yes. Mr. Speaker, there are a couple of points I really want to make. I think one has been made already, but I really want to add my voice to that one in particular. And I speak also as a descendant of enslaved Africans. Yeah. And so I know how important land and ownership is to those of us with a history of being denied. And so when I stand and I speak on this issue, understand that that also is one of the perspectives from which I speak. I also speak, Mr. Speaker, because I know personally I have spoken to too many individuals who have been euphoric, who have been joyful in accepting and getting that key to their own home. Yes, yes. I have spoken to too many of them who have sat with me and who have poured out their heart as they find it difficult to maintain payment for those mortgages. I have spoken to too many individuals who have had to rent their houses because they cannot afford to live in there because they can't really afford to pay that mortgage. And so, Mr. Speaker, while the kids in us will play, today I am not treating this as an issue to take lightly. I am speaking on behalf of those individuals who today do not find themselves in the house, but those individuals who would want to know that we understand their pain, we understand the struggle, we understand what they feel like when they come to you in tears because their house has been repossessed, because regardless of how hard they have tried, they have been unable to maintain that mortgage. So, Mr. Speaker, I am one of those agreeing that we need to get to a point where we are looking at a mortgage that spans generations. Because for many individuals, that is the only way they are going to be able to live in that house while they pay for it. It's the only way they are going to be able to move out of where they are, which is not satisfactory. And knowing that they have a house elsewhere is the only way to get them inside there. And I believe that those of us who sit here today have an obligation to treat it seriously enough to put forward some of those kinds of solutions that will make a lasting difference. Mr. Speaker, I'm ready. Mr. Speaker, often some of us stand here and we speak on important issues, and there are individuals making light of it. But the truth is that they don't come from our realities. So those of us who live a particular reality have to speak it, while others jeer, while others see it as something that is not of great importance. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing that compares to the joy of being able for the first time to hold your own door key. But equally, there is nothing more devastating than losing it. And therefore, I believe when we look at it, we also have to look not just on the young professional, not just on that minimum wage earner, who also should have in the land of their birth an opportunity and a pathway to owning their home. They should. But we also have to look on the reverse to make sure that they keep it as well. And so, Mr. Speaker, if we're talking about the intergenerational loans, one is that you have a longer period to pay it, but also you have a smaller and therefore more manageable sum to pay, which makes it more bearable for far more persons. And I would want to urge, in whatever we do on the solution and the mix, that we take that into consideration. It is not by accident, Mr. Speaker, that so many of us, when we want to own our opinions, when we want to speak without fear, we say that is me, have my own door key. It means something to us as Jamaicans. Nobody can stop you, nobody can take it out of you, because you own your own door key. And I believe, therefore, that that aspiration that so many people have, so many Jamaicans have, it is part of what makes us who we are. And we have to do everything we can to preserve it. And with these few words, I add my support to the resolution, to the motion moved by the member from Central St. James that is on the floor, that I believe also requires, as the other member said from Trelawney, not just our debate, but our action. Thank you.
Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that's okay. Mr. Speaker, I rise once again. This time, Mr. Speaker, it is more from a
emotional standpoint than anything else. Mr. Speaker, my constituency is made up of 77% informal settlement. So you understand where I'm coming from, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues today have said enough that I could just ask that the resolution be approved and I sit. But it would be remiss of me not to speak on behalf of the constituents that I swear to serve. Mr. Speaker, when you have a young married couple paying $35,000 or more per month in rent, Mr. Speaker, you ask yourself the question, would it not be better if they were paying to their own? Mr. Speaker, too often I hear persons who are way over the 40 age limit asking the question, MP, how can you help me get a house? Mr. Speaker, it is not an easy task. Yes, National Housing Trust has been doing quite an amount. But what we ask today, Mr. Speaker, is for them to do just a little bit more. And that little bit more, Mr. Speaker, is just to absorb the first and last payment, as they call it. And then you ask the client to pay it in the mortgage, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we want to get rid of the informal settlement. Dr. Chang knows it more than anybody else, because he, as a mentor of mine, knows very well what Canterbury is like, what Rose Heights is like, what Salt Spring is like, what Norwood Flanker is like, Mr. Speaker. It's not that they don't want to earn or to pay for what they want or need, Mr. Speaker. It's that the opportunity is not being given to them. And therefore, today, in closing, Mr. Speaker, I ask this Honourable House, let us move swiftly. Let us move with haste, that those that we serve, those that we swear to serve, we can have them living in comfort. Mr. Speaker, friction is not an easy thing, you know. When you rub two stones together, you know what you get? Fire. It's the same thing when too many people rubbing too close together. The only thing that you're going to get from it is fire. So Mr. Speaker, I humbly ask today, Mr. Speaker, that the resolution, Mr. Speaker, be approved and sent to the appropriate committee for other deliberation. Thank you.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Ayes have it. House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I am literally basking in the success of today's set of debates without contention, constructive dialogue, which is what we search for. Mr. Speaker, we now have an extremely, and I'm looking forward to the presentation by the member from West Rural St. Andrew, who will speak on the private member's motion number 61 standing in our name.
Yeah.
Mrs. Cuthbert-Finn.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for this opportunity to stand in this honorable house once again. Whereas a public opinion survey conducted by Hope Enterprise in 2006 found about 60% of Jamaicans support the legislation of termination of pregnancy under special conditions such as incest, endangerment of the woman's physical or mental health and or life. And whereas a 2018 poll conducted by Johnson Survey Research Limited on a woman's right to choose, which was sponsored by the Ministry of Health, the Gleaner, and the National Health Fund, found that 67% of men and 82% of women believe the government has no place in determining if or when a woman ends her pregnancy. And whereas research conducted in 2014 found that 43% of expectant mothers who were admitted with complications at the Victoria Jubilee had attempted abortions. And whereas the government of Jamaica has ratified a convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, and the Sustainable Development Goals, which require the government to take necessary steps to reduce maternal mortality by addressing the surrounding factors which contribute to it, including unsafe abortions. And whereas Sections 72 and 73 of the Offences Against the Persons Act criminalize abortion and the provision of support to any woman who's about to have an abortion, while health facilities across the country, including the Victoria Jubilee, provide support to women who present with complications from unsafe abortions, effectively and contradictorily being an accessory to a crime after the fact. And whereas all parliamentarians in this honourable house have a moral obligation to ensure women can enjoy their personhood without interference, and whereas the government has an obligation to give women who need to procure an abortion with access to safe and affordable services for the termination of pregnancies, be it resolved that this honourable house consider the recommendations of the Abortion Policy Group, which was established to provide guidance to allow women the right to choose. Be it further resolved that this honourable house has taken steps to repeal Sections 72 and 73 of the Offences Against the Persons Act and substitute thereof a civil law titled Termination of Pregnancy Act, as recommended by the Abortion Policy Review Group in 2007. Mr. Speaker, in 2018, I lost one of my constituents, a young woman who was in her late 20s, and she died due to complications of a botched abortion. She was vibrant, full of life, very smart, and I'm saddened by what happened. Her death was avoidable, and it haunts me to this day. I, as a parliamentarian, feel partially responsible for the grief the family and friends have had since the passing of my constituents. I feel that I have a personal responsibility as a lawmaker to do something. I've attended sit-ins and have done nothing to ensure people like her do not have to risk their lives due to unsafe abortions. Mr. Speaker, I want to be the voice for women to have the right to choose. I stand therefore before this honourable house as a woman, as a mother, and a legislator for those women who are being frustrated by the illegality of abortion in this country. I stand for those women and teenagers who were forced by the state to carry a child that is a result of a rape by uncle we see and hear so many of these by their cousins, their guardians, other relatives, coach, pastors, and strangers. I stand for those women and teenagers who took ill or died trying to terminate a pregnancy like the person I knew. I stand for more than 200,000 women who could face life imprisonment because they procured an abortion in the last 10 years. I stand for those women who, because safe, affordable, and accessible services to terminate pregnancies are illegal in this country, use questionable service by unqualified individuals, and now might not be able to have children in the future when they truly want to. Mr. Speaker, the members of this House are old enough to know that the illegality of abortion has not in any way prevented women from procuring one from a qualified or less than qualified medical profession or attempting to do so on their own. We know of those cases. We hear about those cases from time to time, and it's not just persons from a certain background who are getting abortion. Many women, or many Jamaicans, including some, if not all of us here today, have heard rumors of women, teenagers in our communities, in constituencies, who have terminated pregnancies by some botched procedure. The World Health Organization estimates that 22,000 Jamaicans, women aged 15 to 44 years, terminate their pregnancies every year. Sadly, due to the illegality, many women, teenagers, become sick. Some die due to complications from mismanaged procedure. Mr. Speaker, according to the WHO, abortion complications are the 8th leading cause of maternal deaths in Jamaica, affecting adolescents primarily. And I went to a seminar in Trinidad, and this was something that we actually spoke about. This concerns me as a member of this Honourable House. The current law frustrates thousands of Jamaicans, women, especially poor women, who are in desperate need of termination services that are safe, affordable, and accessible. Too many of our women and teenagers are putting themselves at risk because they have to seek out these services underground. In 2005, for example, Ward 5 at the Jubilee Hospital, which deals exclusively with abortions, had 641 patients who were all from inner city communities and single. A third of these patients were teenagers. 40% of them admitted to having a previous termination of pregnancy, and about 30% had 2 or more previous abortions. Mr. Speaker, it is time for the Parliament to no longer sit on the sidelines while debates rage around the false dichotomy of this pro-choice and pro-life. A pro-life stance cannot involve the sacrifice of the lives of women who undergo unsafe abortions, and a pro-choice stance cannot exist without a broader conversation and surrounding factors which influence a woman's choice to have an abortion. This Parliament has a duty to take a stance. I have a duty to take a stance, not on either side of the debate, but a stance around protecting the lives of women, particularly poor women, regardless of public opinion about the value of their life. In 2007, the Abortion Policy Review Group, after extensive consultation, made several recommendations which this Parliament has not acted on, to repeal the relevant sections of the Offences Against the Persons Act and substitute it with a civil law titled Termination of Pregnancy Act, stating the conditions under which medical termination of pregnancy will be lawful. As parliamentarians of this Honourable House, we have a moral obligation to take positive steps to ensure women can enjoy their personhood without interference. We have a duty to listen to the 67% of men and 82% of women who believe the government has no place in determining if or when we choose to end a pregnancy. Members, let us speak for the women and the teenagers across the country who have no voice. Mr. Speaker, the time is now for us to give women a right to choose.
Mr. Speaker, it is not intended that we would debate this matter today. We will not conclude the debate, so we will do that next week when we meet. And it is a pattern that I would like to adopt, because usually debates of this magnitude requires a lot of time. And we don't often have as much time as we would like to have, because it is my intention to have all the motions on this paper brought to this Honourable House and debated. So we would not be completing that today. So I ask that it be suspended until the next sitting of the House.
Those in favour?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it. House Leader.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I move to the final item on the list today, and it is not expected, although I know that we have had a long but very productive day in the House. And so I'm going to call now on the member from Western Westmoreland and former Minister of Tourism and Chairman of the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, the PAAC, to present the reports 23, 24, 25, and 27. That has been long outstanding. I intend to bring all of those up to the current state so that we are not debating or not discussing the findings of the deliberations that spans years. So, member?
Mr. McNeil.
Yes.
Mr. McNeil.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's not my intention to be very long. I'm trying to follow your example. Mr. Speaker, there are a number of reports. I actually have 5 that I'm clearing up. And I think maybe one more sitting like this will be up to date. As we said last week, one of the difficulties we have is that once the PAC, the reports are too tardy, then the recommendations are not timely. So we have not as relevant as when taken at the appropriate. So hopefully once we get to speed, we'll deal with the more current ones which are now ongoing. So what I'm going to do, Mr. Speaker, is not go too deeply into the findings, but more just into the recommendations and deal with the reports. The first report was the Fiscal Policy Paper Interim Report 1718. The Fiscal Policy Paper 1718. Mr. Speaker, given the fact that we just debated the Fiscal Policy Paper week before last, I think it was, for 1819. But one of the things though, just to the Leader of Government Business, one of these papers are debated, so I don't think that they are rightfully that the report should be taken after, because they're debated at the same time that it is presented. The second report, Mr. Speaker, you could ask your deputy House Leader around there if you can.
To give you a chance.
Yes. Yes. Mr. Speaker, the second report is from the Ministry of Local Government and Community Development. Just to make the point that in that report, Mr. Speaker, we reviewed the operations of the entities
with us that day were Social Development Commission, the Office of Disaster Preparedness, the Jamaica Fire Brigade, Solid Waste, Board of Supervision, and the Parochial Development Fund. Mr. Speaker, this meeting was held in February 2017. Just to say, Mr. Speaker, that when we reviewed these entities, there were a few findings that were relevant. The first one was that the members were concerned about the high cost of street lighting and urged that the program to replace 105,000 sodium lamps with smart LED systems be implemented expeditiously. The Minister of Finance spoke about that in the supplementary budget last week. In relation to the SDC, the PAAC felt that the provisions for programs, this was with the Social Development Commission, and we had a long discussion with them, Mr. Speaker. We felt that the provision for programs for the SDC were very inadequate. We found that there was only $13 million allocated for the SDC, and that we had made a recommendation that additional funding had to be made. Mr. Speaker, just to give the recommendations for the meeting with local government, the recommendations are that the LED streetlight project should be implemented in short order to reduce electricity costs. Matters such as the implementation of new systems and negotiations with JPS be handled by the Ministry of Science, Energy and Technology. The audits of the streetlights should be conducted by the respective municipal corporations, and that lands that are owned by persons who are deceased, for which property tax are owed, persons in possession of these lands should regularize to ensure greater compliance, and that the fees charged by the SDC to administer education projects should be removed. These were some of the recommendations that were made in that meeting. The third report, Mr. Speaker, has to do with the University of the West Indies. And, Mr. Speaker, there is something here that I think is important. Members will remember that when the University of the West Indies came before the PAAC in October 2016, when they were first invited to come, they declined to appear, arguing that as a regional entity, they were not answerable to they were answerable to the University Council and not the Parliament of any particular nation. An opinion obtained from the Jamaica's Attorney General reasoned that the University Charter did not preclude the University of the West Indies participation before a National Parliamentary Committee. And as a recipient of funding from the government of Jamaica, UWI was obliged to appear before the PAAC upon request. So they appeared before us. A notable observation from UWI, Mr. Speaker, was that while the faculty had contributed over 1,500 research papers, to peer-reviewed journals, researchers at Mona had registered only one patent in 2015, and that this suggests a very low commercialization of the request. Mr. Speaker, the recommendations here were that, number one, students who are unable to complete a payment of tuition fees should not be barred from sitting exams. It was recommended by the committee that there be payment plans in place to facilitate such students, and where students receive financial support, they could be bonded. But it was felt, Mr. Speaker, that we had to look in, given that we were supporting financially the university, that this thing of them not allowing the students to sit the exam was something that had to be looked into. That there should be greater collaboration between the university and the private and public sectors. It is the view of the members that having adjunct professors within the various fields will ensure that students have practical knowledge. Additionally, the professionals could benefit from research conducted by the university. Just saying, Mr. Speaker, that one of the things that the committee was saying is that the university, in putting itself in place in working closely with the private sector and public sector, could do studies that are more relevant to the country. It is recommended that the university identify the areas of greatest need in order for most of the available funding to be allotted to those areas. And the fourth, which was something that we found, was that similar to the University of Technology, the University of the West Indies should employ a customer service advocate to create a student-friendly environment and provide assistance to students where necessary. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, that we found is that at UTech, they have in the bursars department, they have a customer service advocate. So what happens is that a lot of students, when they have problems paying the school fees or the school fees overdue and they're having problems, they don't have anybody to talk to. And that UTech had put in place this customer service advocate that the students could call and would track down their cases and give them advice. And it was working out well. And we were suggesting that it is something that through the Minister of Education, it is something that could be recommended to the University of the West Indies as well. The fourth report, Mr. Speaker, has to do with the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, MLSS. Mr. Speaker, there were a number of issues that we looked at the Ministry of Labour. The PAC was informed that the National Insurance Fund, now at that point, this was in June 2017, that the National Insurance Fund now stands at $95.4 billion and that the NIF had received $15.2 billion in contributions in 2016-17 and paid out pensions amounting to $15.85 billion. So basically what they're taking is what they're letting out. In relation to PATH, the PAC learned that there were 354,500 beneficiaries as of April 2017. One of the issues that we found is that in relation to the labor market, it was observed that for the period January to March 2017, the Ministry of Labour had reported that there had been a 57% increase in work permits issued, 1,698 compared to 965 for the corresponding period the previous year. And the PAC also observed that many employment contracts were now being written to obviate statutory provisions relating to redundancy payments and rights to hearings before dismissal. Yes. These are the ones that I'm late. Yes. No, I'm not talking. Yes, and I won't. Yes. Yes. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Among the recommendations from the Ministry of Labour, were that consideration should be given for the transportation allowance under the PATH program to be administered by the schools to ensure that they are used for their intended purpose. The other recommendation, Mr. Speaker, is that foreign nationals should not be granted work permits for jobs that Jamaicans are available and qualified to do. It was one of the recommendations made by the committee. The other recommendation, Mr. Speaker, is that Parliament may need to clarify the role of the Industrial Disputes Tribunal over employment contracts whose termination clauses seem to differ from Jamaican law and principles of natural justice. Mr. Speaker, the last report, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, please. The deputy leader keeps speaking. You can go outside and have a drink, you know, we won't mind. Yes, please. Mr. Speaker, the last report had to do with NROC. And there were a few points that I think are important to us. The report has in it the findings, but there were three things that we recommended. The first is that in future, all Crown lands to be sold or transferred must undergo valuation before the transfer. But what we found is that in this debate, this negotiation that's taking place now over the North-South Highway, a lot of the lands, it was an acreage of land and not a valuation. And so what we had asked is that in future, we look at that. The second recommendation, Mr. Speaker, is that a regulatory or legal provision should be introduced requiring toll charges to be suspended in the event of hurricanes or other catastrophes to allow free movement of persons. We see now that even right now, with the storm that's hitting the United States, they are opening up all the toll roads and letting them free. I don't know whether or not we have that within our regulations, but it was a recommendation by the committee. And the third, Mr. Speaker, is that the designs of roadways should be carefully planned to minimize the runoff of marl or silt on the roadway. It goes into more detail in the report, but one of the things that we have found out is that even with the building of highways, we must be very careful of the environmental impact that it is having. Already in the first highway that was built, there are talks of areas of how it has impacted the environment. So we're now saying in the east-west, we have to take specific note of the environmental impact that it may have when we're building it. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, those are the 5 reports. I think that we have now maybe 4 outstanding, and we will take those on another day. So, Mr. Speaker, I move that the reports of the five reports be adopted by Parliament. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, we have had a good day. It's not intended to do any further business. So I invite you to adjourn this Honourable House until next week, Tuesday. 2 p.m. sharp. What? Well, next week, Tuesday. At 2 p.m. Sharp. 2 p.m.
The motion is that the House be now adjourned until next week, Tuesday the 16th at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This House now stands adjourned.